I could not agree more with you on that VO2 max is probably, or still today, the holy grail for understanding basically longevity, or let's say the best marker or metric we have in order to quantify it. Because to just elaborate a little bit further on that, you can also say that, well, VO2 max is a measure of something, so we are measuring something in the end there. But we could, and to be a little bit crude, you could say that, okay, fine. Some people could say, well, having a good heart. Having a good heart is a good predictor of longevity, for example. But I'm pretty sure we can find people that are in the bed and they are really sick that still have a really good heart. So obviously that then you understand that, well, there have to be more nuances to this than just the heart itself. You can have people that has a great heart and everything looks good, lungs perfect, everything like this, but they have neurological diseases, for example. All of these will limit you from reaching a high VO2 max, which is, again, so integral. It basically just encompasses all these kind of things, because you can't reach a high VO2 max if any of these functions here are not good.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Drive Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Attia. Olav, thank you so much for making time to sit down with me today. I'm really excited about this episode, and I'm going to try to contain my own enthusiasm such that the people listening to this will understand what we're talking about, because the topic we're going to go into today is really one that fascinates me to no end. But more than that, you are someone who brings a level of expertise that is so high that it really allows me to kind of engage at a level of curiosity that I rarely get to engage in. And I don't think I've taken more notes coming into a podcast than I have for this one. I fully expect we will not get through half of what I've written down in terms of topics that I want to explore, but nevertheless, I'm going to apologize in advance to you and to everybody else for just how enthusiastically I want to address the subject matter of human performance. Perhaps before we get into that, though, maybe you could just tell folks who let's assume people don't know anything about you and who you are, Olav. Just tell them who you are, what you do, and the types of athletes that you work with.
Okay, so to try to make a linear story, I actually grew up on a farm on the west coast of Norway. I had to participate in a lot of work at the farm when I was a kid. I didn't, let's say, against my will, because I saw my neighbors and others were playing, and I would very much like to do that as well. But I think for sure in my now today, and already a long time ago, I already started to really appreciate all the work or the hardship, more or less. But fast forward, I already developed a very keen interest for technology already as a kid, and I was extremely curious. I liked to really pick things apart and understand how things were put together. Fascinated about everything from the universe and rockets and so on. And of course, living at the farm, you also get the possibility to pick apart a lot of machineries and other things and see how this is working. And so, being with animals, I have a very strong connection with animals. But I also started to develop, as I started to grow a little older, I started to get very interested in more things that were more extreme. I had an attraction towards things that were extreme. So extreme sports, typical, were a thing that I really that resonates a lot with me. There are probably no extreme sport I haven't participated in on call it on a okay level. Then I took my degree in electrotechniques, went on to engineering, found out that I was not cut for the 8 to 4 working style. For me, it was more about entrepreneurship. I like to build things, innovate new things, solve things that nobody have solved before. those, again, a little bit extreme things that basically are abstract really, really fascinates me. So in 2011, there was an event happening in my life. This was after I actually I had started my second company. We were into the mountains. We had to use helicopter to get into the mountains. There was a big, or basically half my family died on this trip into the mountains. It made a shift in my life, and I decided for various reasons, I got even more into sports. So I was then asked to start to combine the field of exercise physiology and technology, or my strength in technology, and see whether we could start to take more of, let's say, more research. A lot of the research that typically happens in laboratory settings or even in microbiology, where you're taking out components and looking at how does it react. But we very rarely are able to transform that back into humans in a way that makes us the same difference. So how could we now study people, use technology to study people, especially elites, for example, in the setting where they normally exercise, and even use that to continue to drive performance? And then, of course, today, three of my personal athletes, Christian Blumenfeld, Gustav Iden, Ken Janina, and they hold all the records that are in triathlon: short course, long course, Olympic medal, world championship medal, short course, the Ironman world championship 70.3, and full distance from Kona and St. George last year. And it's been an incredible journey, because one thing is, of course, what I have contributed to with them, but I really like a collaborative way of working. So I learn always from them as well, because I'm very curious about how they feel, what they see, how they perceive different things, because there's a lot of things we can measure with data, and there's a lot of things we can't measure with data still. So you need also that context as well. And mainly today, we are actually building a company where we're scaling these companies using AI, so numerical models, large language models, into a company called Enthalpy, like physics, of course. So enthalpy and thermodynamics are some fundamental laws humans can't escape, no matter how unique we think we are. And then on the other side, I work also as a coach for coaches mainly. So I'm more coaching coaches at Olympic level, World Tour level, racing at the highest levels. So that's a long introduction on me.
Well, let's start with some fundamentals, because we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about extreme performance and peak performance around the types of sports in which you're coaching athletes. So, the triathlete is kind of a remarkable athlete in several levels. The first being that he or she must be very good in 3 disciplines that are related but quite distinct. Different body types. If you look at the world's best swimmers, the world's best cyclists, and the world's best runners, they actually have quite different physiology depending on the distances they race, and certainly different methods of training. And the triathlete, therefore, has to be really respected, because they have to be almost world-class in each of those things to be world-class in their sport. And their physiology as a result of that is remarkable. And there are so many things that we're going to talk about today, including temperature management, energy expenditure, energy consumption, all these things. That said, I'm going to, I want to make sure that the listener is able to follow where we go, and we're going to get into some really serious weeds, right? We're going to talk about MCT transporters for shuttling lactate out of cells and all of those things, because that's where I want to go. But I want to make sure people understand the fundamentals, the very basics. So humor me as we go through kind of the 101 of ATP production and utilization. So you and I are sitting here right now having a discussion. And of course, our body is converting all the while chemical energy into electrical energy, back into chemical energy, and it requires the substrates of oxygen and hydrocarbons to do that. Can you explain, in a little bit of detail, exactly what that process looks like for us right now as we're sitting here under obviously a very low physiologic demand?
So you on a very deep level, or do you want more like a high level?
Let's start high level.
Okay. I think one of the things, Roche, they made there's a really beautiful map, call it a map, made by Roche. I think it's called Roche. They are a medical supplier.
You mean the Swiss pharmaceutical company, ROCHE?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So they made a really beautiful map, which is still not exhausted. We are continuously learning new things that we can add to this map. And this map is called, there are two maps they basically distinguish between, and is one that they call the metabolic pathways, another one they call the signaling pathways. And on the metabolic pathways, we have, of course, many ways that we can convert energy from. So we mainly, of course, it's proteins, it's fats, it's carbohydrates that we are converting basically from a substrate or from the food that we ingest and we store in our body, to then basically ATP, which is the main fuel source that the muscles or different muscles in the body are using, or different functions in our body is using in order to survive. And of course, to convert those substrates also into ATP, also there's oxygen required. But there are many, many different pathways. And the problem a little bit with this as well is that even though this is a field which we have studied quite a lot, we are still learning more, and we don't fully understand it still either. And that's why very often, actually, to bring it up maybe to where I think is more useful very often to work on this, is that if you dig too much into some of these different things, that you lose track, you start to lose track exactly of how do you increase performance of somebody as well. Because to use another example, today we have, for example, smartwatches and other things as well that are trying to say something about our sleep, and it's derived or inferred basically from movement from your wrist, for example, and it's based on HRV. But the problem is also when we're looking at, okay, what is performance? So if we say the calorimetry, so again back to thermodynamics or fundamental laws. On the one side, humans needs to move. That's what we do. So we're sitting here now in the chairs. We're moving around. I'm moving gesticulating with my hands and these kind of things. We are nodding with our heads. And all this requires energy in order to do that. And that's movement. You can track this movement. You could even quantify it in centimeters or meters or whatever over a day for each of our components, or globally when we are running, for example, the distance we cover. But in order to do so, obviously, we need an energy source. We need energy from somewhere. And of course, the currency for the muscles or for any things in your body is basically ATP. But in order to create ATPs, then basically we need different substrate to be broken down. And in order for combustion to take place, we need oxygen. This is like most people probably remember the fire triangle, where basically you need oxygen, you need temperature, and then we need something to combust. And of course, oxygen is probably the most practical way today, of course, to measure exactly how much energy are we using at any given time. And then, of course, we can always start to break this down and try to understand how much ATPs this release, or what is the energy yield from that amount of oxygen. But this is also highly different also in humans. Some humans will be more efficient, and typically elites are very efficient at this, while normal population will probably be less efficient at this to create energy. So typically then to round that up, I would say that very often, or the way that I very often work today, is to not lose track. Because on one side, of course, I have a large team around me with people that are extremely good at this. One of the researchers that I work with, he was just actually now recognized as the #1 researcher in the cycling world this year. And they are digging a lot into everything from enzymatic activities to how energy is being released and so on. How can we do this better? But one thing that I found very much more useful is actually that we need sometimes just to black box this, and we have to remember what is important there. So we know movement is the most important part to humanity. So being able to move. If we can sit at work, we can sit there at the podcast, but then basically afterwards we still have an energy surplus that allows us to come home and move around with our kids and play and be kind to our wives and help them out at home and so on. That's a situation we all feel good with. That's what we all want. So then the question is, how do we do that? So how can we track different parameters to understand how we can get there? And this is where I think very often that looking at more of, let's say, humans as an engine or as a machine, where you say, okay, there's a fuel and an energy input. So you look at oxygen consumption, for example, because this you can do with a car, even with a car. And then you look at, okay, you have power. So most people will probably have a power meter, but if they are cycling and a little bit more, if you don't have, it really is not that important, because anyway, the output from this process will be distance per time. And one thing that we see also between, let's say, less trained people or people that are, or to put another way, people are putting in less volume into their training, is also that very often, in order to do a certain amount of work, or let's say moving a certain distance, has a higher oxygen cost, or basically a higher calorie cost for them to move that distance as well. So I think on the one side, I'm very fascinated about breaking down things into the, let's say, the smaller details. But the problem is that we have a limit to how much time we have available, and how do we then make sure that we get the best, or how can we then make sure that the things that we do, the interventions we plan, the changes we make to our lives, how can we then quantify what it has an effect? One, of course, is the ultimate measurement of this is ultimately distance per time. But in order to understand what mechanisms are actually happening here now, we can measure, of course, if you have a power meter or power meter technology, we can start, is it biomechanically driven? So are you improving your biomechanics? Or we can look at between power, so work basically, and calorimetry. Is it the biochemical part that is improving? And we can even then decide just to say, okay, we black box it. We don't necessarily need to understand it, because we can see whether things are improving or not improving. If it does improve, continue to do more of it. If it doesn't improve, then we basically say, okay, fine, we can dig more deeper into it. And that's where, of course, we have specialists and others around us that basically are trying to understand exactly what is happening on a deeper level.
So let's use some real examples on that. And I want to just kind of synthesize what you said a little bit, because it's very interesting. So one of the first things you said is, look, the metric that matters is velocity. You described it as distance per unit time, but of course that's velocity. So if you're a runner, if you're a cyclist, if you're a swimmer, if you're a triathlete, the winner and loser is determined by velocity, not power output, not any other metric. Yeah. So obviously, there's a very strong correlation between power normalized to weight and velocity, but it is not one-to-one. And I'll use an example, especially in a triathlon or a time trial where aerodynamics matters significantly. You can have people that put out more power, but they create more drag. And obviously, that's very true in swimming as well. In running, obviously, there's running efficiency that can speak to energy expenditure versus velocity. So velocity is king. I like the way you kind of broke it down into two drivers, right? You can have how efficient are you at using the energy source to make the ATP? What is your loss ratio there? So presumably majority of that energy is lost in the form of heat. But some of it, of course, is, and we typically, I remember, used to use like a 1:5 ratio. So you could sort of take the number of kilojoules, divide by 5. That was approximately going to be your energy expenditure. But let's come back to that, because that's obviously very crude. But then you said, no, look, you also have to be equally focused on your mechanical efficiency. That gets to what I just talked about. First of all, is that a reasonable synthesis of what you just said?
Yeah, and you can split it also into, because here it helps to, when you look at mechanical part, it's also when you look between power and velocity, then you can of course say that one component is of course the biomechanical part, but another part of it is also the work economy, or where you basically look at equipment, for example, so aerodynamics and other things as well. So there are two components, but purely if you look at the human locomotion, then basically it's exactly like you break it down. Yeah.
I'm going to share with you one really funny example before we come back to this. So 10 years ago, back when I used to ride a bike, and the only thing I would do was time trial. That was my favorite event to do. And one of our favorite, I had two partners that I trained with who were both much better than me, collegiate cyclists. And we used to do this workout every Saturday, which was an 80-kilometer ride on a time trial circuit. So it's, closed off, it's flat, it's, I think each loop was maybe 7 or 8 kilometers. But here was the thing we used to do. We used to not allow ourselves to go over 200 watts. So we had a power meter, and the SRM will tell you exactly what your wattage and your average wattage is. So you had to keep that average watt at 200, not 201, not 199. And each week we would see if we could get faster and faster while keeping the wattage at 200. And as you know, 200 watts is not a lot of watts, of course. So it was not hard to hold that for the 80 kilometers. But, over the span of a year, I think, if I remember correctly, we were able to increase our velocity from maybe, I want to say like 20.5 miles per hour to maybe 22 miles per hour, which is a very significant improvement in efficiency. And I'm curious, how much of that do you think we did by getting better in our CDA, our coefficient of drag times frontal surface area, which I will tell you didn't require new equipment? And then how much of that do you think we did metabolically? In other words, that we metabolically got better at turning energy into power?
So first of all, of course, when you have a power meter, you don't know how more metabolically,
Right.
how much the metabolic efficiency
Right.
increased.
We're missing, we missed the VO2
exactly.
data. We have no idea what oxygen consumption did in that year. That's right.
Exactly. So that part is not a part of the equation. But if you look at work economy, then I think there are a couple of things there. Mainly, of course, since a power meter on a bike like the SRM only measures the, let's say, the net mechanical power. So it basically only measures the component of power that actually goes in the direction that you are actually moving the crank arm.
Yep.
And of course, already there are two components, but that we don't have to focus on that here. But that's where the difference between net mechanical power and gross mechanical power comes in, of course. And maybe, I don't know, maybe we touch even further on this, because there are also several ways to produce 200 watts as well, because you can also have a very large intracyclic power also.
Oh no, sorry, I should make this point. The goal was to keep average power and normalized power the same. So no bursts of power. Yep.
Yeah, no, but even there, actually, what most people don't realize is that when basically your power meter shows 200 watts and you keep it super steady around 200 watts as well, you'll actually have inside 1 second or 1 revolution, for example, you'll already there have a variation of power that is closer to where you're, let's say it's 200 watts. You will have a peak power production, I would say, probably for you, because of your focus and how determined you were there. Probably you were sitting on the nicer side of it, but I wouldn't be surprised for some people riding 200 watts to be pushing 1,000, 1,200 watts, for example, peak throughout every single revolution.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow. So this is something we already quantify by the power meters. But since we don't have to focus on that part here, because you're measuring the locomotive part of the power component, then I would say there's a couple of things that is very interesting. One is, of course, that you say that you are already riding at a power output which is very comfortable. And I think that is important in many senses when you really want to work on your work economy for here, because here we have already excluded the biomechanical part of it, because since you are not looking at the difference between gross mechanical power and net mechanical power, then we are already said that, okay, we don't care even about the biomechanical part. We are only looking now basically on, let's say, what is transferred into forward propulsion or velocity. So in this sense, I would say that but when you're riding 200 watts, what I think is really important and undervalued is that as the harder we go, more of our oxygen and blood will basically be prioritized towards, one, driving the muscles forward. Secondly, also even more for cooling. And you hit it pretty spot on when you say there's a 20% efficiency, 80% heat, 20%. That's what we see pretty much for elites, not for people less. But as you said, we'll come back to that probably. So then basically, when you are focused on this, I think there are no better setting when you ride at a little bit lower power. It allows you to be very mindful and cognitive present to your movement and how you are in the bike there and everything there. And this is some things that I see very often is a difference between also the specialists and the triathletes as well. Because the triathletes are much more inclined to solve tasks brute force than the specialists are. The specialists are because they simply have more time on lower intensity, medium intensity, and high intensities, or let's say especially lower intensities. They tend very often exactly to build a better feeling for how they are moving through the landscape more efficiently by doing exactly like you say. You look at the 200 watts and it becomes so measurable because you can start to evaluate what is happening with your velocity as a function of that. You just see that, okay, I'm creeping down with my head a little bit, and you start to feel these nuances. Because to summarize it, or to not to summarize it, but to maybe end it a little bit here, is that when you go to a wind tunnel, one of the problems with going to a wind tunnel is that you go in there and you do something that is like a spot. It's a spot picture exactly of the position that you're holding for the moment. I don't know how many hours is spent into a wind tunnel, but for various purposes. But obviously, a part of that has been looking at aerodynamics of an athlete. The problem is that the moment you take that athlete off the chair, off the bike, and you put him on the chair and you ask him to go back into the position there, if he doesn't have an outline in front of him that tells him exactly the position to be in, that can already start to offset any other margins that you're looking to gain from, for example, clothing and other things. So in order now to evaluate clothing on an athlete and not on a dummy or a doll, but basically on a live athlete, the problem with that is exactly that if you go off the bike, come back on again, you won't have the same position unless you have an outline that you see that you're fitting yourself into. And the problem with that is exactly that you haven't gotten the time to rehearse your position and actually start to feel and get aware about your whole body position in exactly that position there, which is completely the contrary to when you're riding 200 watts. You're riding at a power output that allows you exactly to have that cognitive access to evaluate yourself, feel yourself, be aware of the surroundings and everything there. And you're basically programming that into your backbone for that this is the position. So when you go out in a race, you have trained that position so deep into your body that you can almost do it blind because you know exactly how that's coming.
I think you're spot on here, Olav, now that we discuss it. I actually think that whatever it is, 5% improvement came almost entirely through frontal surface area. And as you said, it's so relaxed. I mean, we're talking as we're doing this ride, right? It's not a hard ride, which meant all of your cognitive reserve goes into wiggling your way into how narrow can I get my shoulders? What's the best position of my knees on the top tube? All of that kind of stuff. So that's very interesting. And it's also interesting that you point out that it's a luxury that the one sport athlete has. Because at the time, that was the only thing. I mean, I swam, but most of my energy was on the bike. And yes, I think a triathlete would have a harder time maybe justifying that. Do you think a triathlete would benefit, however, from doing some of that kind of training that seems, sort of like junk mileage because it's so low in intensity?
So this is where I would differ because it becomes junk mileage when you're not mindful about there. So of course, this is also where, for example, I know that a lot of people talk about when you do a quality or a high quality or a quality workout, it's a high intensity workout. But basically, how I basically see it instead is that low intensity, medium intensity, and high intensity should all be high quality. All of them should be mindful workouts because you can use them for different purposes.
Yeah.
So exactly when you're doing the lower intensity, it allows you exactly to have that cognitive reserve to basically use your senses to give you better biofeedback and learn better what you can improve, which you will have the cognitive reserve to do when you do the higher intensity workouts, because then you are exactly focusing more on surviving instead. So yes, absolutely. This I think is the most becomes most evident in swimming. In cycling, we actually do see that the triathletes, because the movement pattern and other things that are very, you have very few degrees of freedom when you're sitting on a bike. So in cycling, we see that, for example, the best triathletes in the world are on par, are close to or on par with actually the best cyclists in the world. In running, this, of course, starts to become a little bit bigger difference between them, simply because now you start to allow for a little bit more degrees of freedom. And swimming is, of course, the worst. This is where you have so many degrees of freedom and so poor feedback while so you need to have a very good spatial awareness of your body and what you're doing there in order to allow you to have or to utilize your oxygen for maximum propulsion. To give you an example, we were in the flume at Tenerife T3. So they have there, this is not like a counter current pool where there's a jet sitting in front of you and pumping some water to it. This is a full-fledged, like a wind tunnel. Basically, water is circulated full cross-sectional area around in a huge circle, and there is basically a 3 times 3 meters wide, 1.5 meter deep, 6 meter long cross-sectional area of water just passing over or past you, like you were in an endless ocean, swimming in an ocean. Water quality is perfect. There's no turbulence, no nothing, just pure water running past. We had an athlete there.
Sorry, the athlete is able to swim in place despite it's not like, you know, an endless pool where you're being blasted with a 5-mile-per-hour current 2 feet from your face. You're out far enough in the pool that it just feels like you're in the ocean and you're not moving, but you're using a natural stroke.
So actually, it looks very similar to a wind tunnel. It has the honeycomb structure on both on the front and the back here, and then basically there are some huge fans, pumps sitting in another part of there. So it's not sitting where you are swimming, but basically sitting on a return section instead there.
Mm-hmm.
So basically what happens here is that you're laying in this tank and the water is just passing. So you can just set the speed there in the same way as you do with an endless pool or countercurrent pool. So you set the speed to, for example, 1.5 meters per second, and then you just jump in and you're just swimming there. And you won't, whether you go left or whether you go right or forward or back, the current is exactly the same here because there is no turbulence anymore. So the interesting thing now is that we built a metabolic, so we took a gold standard metabolic cart, and then basically we made hoses and everything and an apparatus that allows them to use this while they are swimming.
So meaning you are able to measure the ventilatory rate of oxygen consumption, carbon dioxide production.
Everything. So the input, basically, you're measuring the fuel consumption of the car and you're looking at what at a certain
and
velocity.
The exhaust, yeah.
Yes, exactly, yeah. So the thing, or not on the exhaust, but well, the exhaust is can measure that, but also on the back wheels, basically, of your car.
Yep.
So then, basically, when they are in the flume there, we know that Christian and Gustav, for example, have a equally high or higher VO2 max than the elite swimmers in the world. And now I'm not talking about where you're comparing running with swimming. We are taking them and measure this in swimming. And the same thing I've done also on elite swimmers. And basically where we say Christian and Gustav has a higher VO2 max, so a bigger engine than the best swimmers in the world, the people that are winning gold in the Olympics.
Yep. So in other words, when you push the speed high enough to the point where they reach the maximum amount of oxygen that they're going to be able to consume, which is equivalent to or linearly equivalent to the maximum energy expenditure. And we always know that the bigger that number, the bigger the engine. They do more. They are able to consume more oxygen and put more calories to work than the world's best swimmers. But of course, you're about to tell us they're not as fast.
Exactly, and the difference is so big that you don't even want to know it. So, for example, we had the bronze medalist from the Olympics swimming in the flume there. He is 195 tall. He weighs more than, I think, let's say around 90 kilograms or more. Like massive guy, a lot of muscles. He goes into the flume, swims at the same velocity as Christian is doing, and is using almost a liter less of oxygen. And it should not almost like that at that point. That was close to 25% less oxygen. And what we also do know, the more muscles you have in the body, the more oxygen you can also consume, because you have almost no muscles. Obviously, there won't be a lot of oxygen consumption because it's the muscles mainly that are using oxygen during basically exercising. So now when you have an athlete that is this massive, obviously you would assume that, okay, he is using and also a lot of oxygen because there's a lot of muscles involved. But because he is so efficient, he actually swam at the same velocity with almost 25% less oxygen consumption than the best triathletes in the world is doing. And that is a little bit mind-boggling, but it just tells how important also efficiency or movement efficiency is into this whole equation as well.
I would argue that is only mind-boggling to someone who has not swum. But as a former swimmer myself, this doesn't surprise me one bit, not one iota, because I came to swimming late in life. I'm an adult onset swimmer, so I didn't swim until I was 31 years old. That's almost 20 years ago. And it never ceased to amaze me, even when I was at my absolute fittest on the bike, when my VO2 max was more than 5 liters, how people with seemingly such a lack of fitness could destroy me in a swimming pool.
Yeah.
And, you know, these people were technically so superior that, you know, I could consume 5 liters of oxygen. They would consume 3, no comparison.
And that's where exactly being mindful and using that cognitive reserve, not to do junk miles, but doing really mindful miles in the pool, on the bike, exactly like you did. It's so important, but very undervalued, and it could have been used so much better.
Super interesting. Well, let's start talking about some of these things. We've already alluded to VO2 and VO2 max, and you've already made a very bold claim, which in the pool is easier to accept, but let's extend it now and let's talk about what it means on the bike and on the run, because people who listen to this podcast have heard me say over and over again that VO2 max is the greatest predictor of lifespan. This is kind of a remarkable statement, again, and I'll repeat it because it is so profound. Whether you smoke or don't smoke, whether you have diabetes or don't have diabetes, whether you have end-stage kidney disease or don't, heart disease not, hypertension or not, all of those things play an important role in predicting the length of your life, but not as much as having a very high VO2 max. This rises above every other biomarker we have to predict the length of life. And the reason I argue that that's probably the case is that VO2 max is an exceptional integrator of work that is done. So for the few times I have patients that will tolerate the mathematical equation, I would say, loosely speaking, VO2 max equals the integral from T1 to T2 of work as a function of time dt. And we know that that work is very valuable for your health, right? We can quantify why it is that exercise helps you live longer. Why is it good for the brain? Why is it good for the heart? Why is it good for the immune system? And therefore, VO2 max becomes a very reproducible way to document that work. And it can't be changed quickly, right? So it's not a cheap biomarker like vitamin D, where you can just take a bunch of, vitamin D supplements and immediately change your vitamin D level. So with all of that said, when we get into the minutia of exceptional human performance, VO2 max is not the best predictor. So let's put swimming aside because it's so obvious there, but why would it not be the best predictor of performance in something like cycling, for example, or running, where the aerodynamic contribution are, in the case of cycling, is easier to mitigate, still nowhere near as bad as swimming, and where the efficiency maybe isn't as important. So where do we see VO2 max not become the most important driver of endurance performance?
So first of all, I could not agree more with you on that VO2 max is probably, or still today, the holy grail for understanding basically longevity or let's say the best marker or metric we have in order to quantify it. Because to just elaborate a little bit further on that, you can also say that, well, VO2 max is a measure of something. So we are measuring something in the end there. But we could, and to be a little bit crude, you could say that, okay, fine. Some people could say, well, having a good heart is a good predictor of longevity, for example. But I'm pretty sure we can find people that are in the bed and they are really sick that still have a really good heart. So obviously that then you understand that, well, there have to be more nuances to this than just the heart itself. You can have people that has a great heart and everything looks good, lungs perfect, everything like this, but they have neurological diseases, for example. All of these will limit you from reaching a high VO2 max, which is, again, so integral. It basically just encompasses all these kind of things, because you can't reach a high VO2 max if any of these functions here are not good. So I couldn't agree more with you. VO2 max is the absolute best predictor of mostly everything, just because that it encompasses all these kind of things. Then on to why doesn't VO2 max become a very good predictor of performance in cycling? I would argue it does, but then we are also starting to reach some more limitations as well. You want to have as a high VO2 max as possible, even as a cyclist. The only problem is that we are now facing some other problems as well when you are an elite athlete, and that is something we call maximum sustainable energy expenditure. So obviously, to turn around more calories per time, that obviously means also that over time you will use more calories as well. And this, in order now to support growth, you obviously have to input more calories also, because you're burning more, you need to bring more in. Otherwise, you are starting to run into deficit and you, worst case, end up with problems. So feeding that, let's say, calorie consumption becomes crucial. Further, the problem is that VO2 max is closely related. So if we wanted to have a surrogate metric for VO2 max, we could typically make an athlete run all out for, let's say, a couple of minutes, 1 to 5 minutes, let's say 3 minutes, to make it simple. Or we can have a cyclist do a 3 minute or 4, 5 minutes, but something short, not too short, but absolutely not too long. But like typically,
like 4 minutes is a pretty good spot.
Exactly. Exactly. This is again a very good proxy to understand, or as a surrogate to understand, of course, what is your VO2 max as well. But then what we have to understand as well, that this is not necessarily what you need in Tour de France. You don't need to be the best 4 minute athlete. This is more important for a track cyclist. A track cyclist that has the working time for 4 hours, for 4 minutes. Then VO2 max becomes maybe the best predictor of performance again. So it's a little bit depending on context. Yeah. But because we already said now there's another limitation here as well, and that is the maximum sustainable energy expenditure. How much energy can you expend on different, let's say, intensities in order to increase, let's say, the speciality of what you're going to be good at? So if you are going to be best in the world at riding 160 kilometers and then sprinting towards the finish line over a couple of 100 meters, you can even not argue that it's a sprint even, but let's say you are really going fast the last kilometers. The problem with this is that if you spend most of that energy that you have available now to increase your VO2 max, you're spending obviously less time on specializing on what you're really going to be good at. And you won't find a track cyclist that you can put into Tour de France and think that he will win Tour de France. And you won't find a Tour de France rider that you can put on a track and become the 1 kilometer or 1 kilometer winner there. Obviously, because they are specializing on two different durations. So simply because we have a limitation for how much energy that we can turn around per day, per week, and so on, sustainably, because that's the key here, sustainably. it basically means also that we have to focus more on that exactly specificity that we're looking to excel in. And then, yes, VO2 max will still be the best predictor, but not necessarily having the highest number. That is maybe the or let's say the nuance to it.
Yeah, and let's stay with cycling, and even keep it simple and just talk about, not include the track, right? Which is, you know, far closer to an anaerobic effort. It's sort of on the anaerobic side of a peak aerobic effort. But even if you think about, let's go back to the distance of the 112-mile time trial that a triathlete is doing in an Ironman, right? So for the most part, I mean, there's no sprinting in there. He's not sprinting at the very end. In fact, he's probably trying to keep that relatively constant in effort to prepare himself or herself to do the marathon run that's following. Even in that system, let's go back and talk about two athletes. If there are two athletes that have the same VO2 max, does power at VO2 max give you another layer of insight? So if, let's just say Christian and Gustav each have a VO2 max of 80 milliliters per minute per kilogram, but one of them is doing that at 450 watts and one of them is doing it at 425 watts. Does that give you a new piece of information, or is it still limited because that's really only speaking to a 4-minute, 5-minute effort?
Yes and no. That is, of course, where you can black box, of course, a little bit. Now we just talk purely about VO2 max, may focus on that. But of course, there will be a fairly good correlation also between the oxygen consumption, let's say at VO2 max, because you can argue that there's really no power at VO2 max, because it, like, as long as you are above what we call VO2 steady state. So you have a couple of different steady state scenarios. You have typically one that a lot of people knows about, which is the maximum lactate steady state. But then, of course, above there, again, you have something called VO2 steady state. And at the moment you start to exceed over VO2 steady state, then basically it's just a matter of duration before you will basically elicit VO2 max. But obviously, the closer you stay to your VO2 steady state, the lower the power you will basically outputting. If you put out a too high power, obviously you won't be able to reach VO2 max, because you will basically start, you will not be able to contract your muscles efficiently anymore, and you won't be able to bring your ventilation or oxygen consumption up to a max. But there's a sweet spot there, more or less, where basically any power that sits between, let's say, VO2 steady state and a higher, let's say, a higher power number will elicit VO2 max. It's just the amount of duration that is needed in order to get there. So, of course, this adds, let's say, uncertainty, because you need to know this. I think it's important just so the listener understands that you can't necessarily just go out and then people start talking about power at VO2 max and their VO2 max, because then suddenly people will get confused, because you have to know also then what was the duration of it as well.
How did you get there? And exactly. Yep. So let's take a quick aside, because you and I are speaking about this with such a degree of familiarity. I want to make sure the listener understands how you're measuring VO2 max in the lab. This is a test that I believe every human being, athlete and non-athlete, should have done, because everybody needs to know their number and everybody needs to know where they stack up against people their age and their sex, because again, it is one of the most important, if not the most important, modifiable metric we have to speak to both the length and quality of life. So if I came into your lab tomorrow to have my VO2 max measured, tell me what we would do.
So the good thing now, of course, is that also VO2 max is being, or let's say metabolic measurements are being democratized as well. There is, for example, we work very closely with a Canadian company called VO2 Master that allows you basically to put now a mask. So it's like, the old age, basically, when you have these big computer towers and everything. Today we have iPhones and Androids that basically have computational power that exceeds millions of times even what the Apollo 11 expedition had.
Right.
Yes. So the same thing is, of course, happening also to the metabolic, let's say, to metabolic analyzers as well. From basically being these huge towers that were basically exclusive to labs to basically where it's now being democratized, and you basically have like this super portable analyzer just sitting on your face, measuring your your oxygen uptake. But to bring it to the lab setting, and what happens there is that you come into the laboratory setting. I don't work so much with relative values, but a lot of people will do. So obviously we're gonna measure your weight, so we get your weight there. And as you just said, you mentioned Christian, or let's say an elite athlete, you said 80 milliliters per minute per kilogram. So we have normalized this to kilogram, and that's why we need to measure your weight. So now when you're running, so what we do is that depending on what kind of modality that's important to you, so let's say that is running, for example, what you'll do is that you get on a treadmill, and basically there is a couple of different, let's say, ways to do this. Whereas let's say the method is pretty much the same, but it can be a little bit of a different gear. Some people will use something that we call mixing chamber system, and some people will use what we call breath-to-breath systems. But it would basically involve you having either a mouthpiece in your mouth, where there sits a analyzer, or not an analyzer, but sits a turbine with a sample line from it. So basically, when you're exhaling in this mask there, or through this mouthpiece, we are measuring the flow, or how much air you are breathing in and out per time as a function of if it's a turbine, then basically we correlate it to how many RPMs this turbine is spinning. So now we know whether you are breathing, for example, 50 liters or 100 liters, 150 liters per minute. But then, of course, now we only measure your ventilation. We don't know anything about your oxygen consumption yet. We only know something about your ventilation. So then what we also have to do is we need a sample line that sticks in there as well, that basically collects now the concentration of oxygen and carbon dioxide as well. So what we then do is that, because we know that the ambient oxygen condition and ambient CO2 conditions is basically, let's say, 20.9% oxygen and then 0.05% CO2, more or less, roughly speaking. While you are now running and you're breathing, you're obviously breathing in a certain amount of oxygen into your lungs, and then you're consuming some of, or let's say, air into your lungs, which contains basically 20.9% oxygen. When that comes into your lungs, parts of that oxygen, far from all of it, actually only closer to 25% of that oxygen, you are actually taking up in your lungs, and it's being now transported through your body, and you're exhaling actually 75%, roughly speaking, 75% oxygen, you actually exhale out again now. And then basically, since we are measuring now the oxygen concentration with this device, we can measure, we know now the delta concentration that sits between what is the oxygen concentration when it goes in, how much is oxygen concentration that goes out. And since we also measure the volume of air, we know we can now extrapolate that and say, okay, this is the amount of oxygen you're actually extracting from there, and this is how we know your oxygen consumption. So why is oxygen consumption important? Well, this comes back to basically calorimetry, and calorimetry actually is very often, people think then immediately of nutrition and foods and these kind of things, but it's actually just a unit. It's actually just a unit, a scientific unit, actually, for knowing how much energy is needed to heat water from 14 to 15 degrees, for example, a certain amount of that, and then how much calories is needed. So we could even use gasoline for this. But it basically comes back to the fire triangle. You need something to combust, you need oxygen, and you need temperature. And basically, when you combust, there's a field. Now I'm getting really nerdy here, but there's a field. So there's a field in biochemistry, which is called, or actually not only biochemistry, about chemistry in general, which is called stoichiometry. So in stoichiometry, there we can basically look at how much. So when we have, like you mentioned initially in the call as well, you talk about hydrocarbons, for example, but let's say carbohydrate, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And then we know how many molecules or how many atoms there are of each of these in that molecule there. And then basically, when we want to convert this into ATPs, for example, then we are breaking this down. So for example, if you look at the glycolysis, we are taking, for example, glucose, which is C6H12O6, and we are breaking that down into two pyruvates, or basically C3H5O3, but we got two of them now. But in this process of releasing ATPs there, at the same time, what happens is also we are releasing hydrogen ions. And this is actually when you feel a burning sensation in your muscles, this is not the lactate. It's actually this that you are feeling in your muscles. Lactate is actually a superfuel. If the muscles get access to both lactate and glucose, it will actually use lactate as a preferred source before even glucose. But then basically, because C3H5O3 basically lacks one hydrogen molecule now, as long as you have an excess of this, then basically you're able to bind back that hydrogen molecule in there, and you get C3H6O3, which is lactate molecule. We've got two of them. So you split one glucose molecules effectively now down to two lactate molecules. But then basically when you're looking now at the energy yield here, basically we know that when you convert basically, let's say from glucose to lactate, for example, there is a certain amount of energy or joules that is released in this process. We can even say, okay, let's forget about even ATPs and make it even a little bit simpler here. What is the potential joules that sits in a glucose molecule? And then when we split this glucose molecule, how many joules are we releasing in this process? And basically, because it says C3 or basically C6H12O6, we know there are 6 oxygen molecules there. And now we can actually calculate, or we can know actually from your oxygen consumption, because that's O2 molecules going in, and then there comes out CO2 molecules, or both O2 molecules, but also CO2 molecules. Mm-hmm. But what we can know now is that we can know exactly, because we can use stoichiometry, and we can basically calculate how much joules has been now released in this process. And that ties back to VO2 max. The more oxygen you are capable of turning around per time, the more calories, or let's say the more fats, proteins, carbohydrates you are able to break down and release energy that you can use for forward propulsion in the process. And that's why VO2 measurements is a holy grail metric, because we can always talk about direct calorimetry, but that's so, let's say, call it intrusive into a process, and so little it's practical to do. So indirect calorimetry measured with VO2 max or VO2 and VO2 max is a superior method to understand how much energy are you able to release in this process. And also then, just to come back a little bit to your field as well, medicine. If you have a low VO2 max, it basically means also at the moment you start to have stress in your lives, you have infections in your lives, anything like this, you are utilizing a much higher percentage of that ability because to get healthy as well, you need energy to get healthy as well, to do whatever, transporting blood around in your body or whatever. Right. So basically, an athlete that has a huge VO2 max that becomes sick, there's a fractional change basically, or a relatively small change of their capacity or reserve that is utilized now in this process. So at the moment they release basically their training, or they reduce the training volume, they get a huge excess of energy or ability to recover now. And if you're quick enough to do it, you won't almost get any infection or increase in infection at all, because the body gets so much energy excess to help aid in the recovery process now, compared to a person which has a so low VO2 max that even walking up the stairs start to bring them to a level where they are even trying to catch
I think that's such a great point, and I don't think people fully appreciate what a physiologic stress significant illness is. So, you know, again, I won't bore people with all of the details, but if you go and do the chemistry on what it takes to raise the body's temperature from 98 Fahrenheit to 103 Fahrenheit, that is an enormous energy cost. When we look at cardiac patients, when we look at any patients in the ICU, and you look at the change in cardiac output that might be required to support a systemic inflammatory response syndrome, it is profound. So I think this is absolutely spot on, and it really comes down to just having more reserve. I want to ask you several questions. Let me try to take them in order. First, you mentioned that you prefer to look at VO2 max in absolute terms. So, I'm guessing that, how much does Christian and Gustav weigh? Those guys probably weigh 75 kilos?
So the funny thing is that leading into the Olympics, one of the things we actually looked even at is basically what happens because we have tried to reduce the weight very conservatively by global standards, even in sports, to reduce the weight because we had already ingrained in our heads from basically a past and other people saying that, well, you need to bring up your relative VO2 max, you need to, and that is done very simply by reducing the weight.
Yep.
The interesting thing was we found after we had done this a couple of times, and a little bit by accident, because we do so much measurements, is that we saw actually that, well, the relative VO2 max that didn't come up and the absolute VO2 max came down even more than the weight came down. And these were not...
They in other words, so let's just make sure people understand exactly what you said. It's very important. And we should use some numbers so people understand. So I'm making this up, but if they weigh 80 kilograms and are putting out 6 liters, or their maximal oxygen consumption is 6 liters, you take 6 liters or 6,000 milliliters divided by 80, and you're going to get a big number. And you're saying, well, gosh, I mean, the tried and true method here is we have to lower that body weight. Why don't we take that body weight from 80 kilos to 75 kilos? And now 6,000 divided by 75 is a much bigger number. All things equal, we're much better. The problem is it's not all things equal because that 6,000 milliliters of oxygen might have come down to 5,500 milliliters per oxygen. And now that ratio has actually gone down.
Exactly. So both absolute have gone down and also relative have actually gone down,
yep.
Which is a little bit of, I think, shocking because most people, this is, you can imagine, we of course have a lot of theories of why, why this is happening, but also why do people still cling to the idea of reducing. So you come up to a certain level. So let's say that you had hundreds of athletes through your program. Suddenly comes this really good, like this guy that just responds, or girl that just responds to your training. He goes to junior level, starts to win, senior level starts to win, starts to go to the championships and whatever. But now you're starting to really like have to fight for the spot. Okay, what do you do? Okay, my training program is perfect. That's something that's very easy to sometimes think, or you're afraid of making changes to the program because you don't necessarily understand exactly why you got there. But we have got ingrained with that, okay, fine, let's reduce the weight now because that will be the next step now because we are not able to make you more powerful. So let's start now to reduce your weight. There are two things happening now. Or one thing is, of course, the things we have observed, the VO2 max starts to come down. Absolute and relative value starts to come down.
And sorry, well, does that happen because you're unable to control where you're taking the weight off? So, for example, are you losing disproportionately lower body muscle mass, which is, I think, disproportionately contributing to VO2 max relative to upper body?
No, I don't. Unfortunately, it is more complicated than that because it is without even losing muscle mass.
So it is related then to basal energy expenditure. If your total body mass is coming down, your basal energy expenditure is coming down. That is probably altering fundamental metabolic pathways at rest that must be translating to what's happening under stress.
Most probably, yes, because this is, of course, something I haven't had enough time to dive into because on the one side, I'm looking more to drive performance. Yep. So sometimes there are some findings that we really want to understand better, but we have to say, okay, that's going to happen in the next life or next period or whatever.
I mean, an interesting experiment to do here, sorry to interrupt, would be to actually use doubly labeled water under the weight-reduced setting compared to the previous setting. Obviously, you could do indirect calorimetry during rest. You wouldn't be able to get total energy expenditure, which is what you want, and see if that drop proportionately corresponds to the drop you saw in VO2 max absolute.
Yeah, so this is also something because you can think of it, and maybe this is just a temporary phase. So maybe this is a temporary phase before you stabilize the weight, and then at some point it will start to come up again as well. But it doesn't either. So that's a little bit the thing here. Also, we can venture a little bit into double label water because we spent a fortune on doing several double label water or blocks, and this is it's a nice method, but it also has several pitfalls. So actually what we have started to do much more of lately is exactly doing resting metabolic rates. So again, having the portable metabolic analyzer like the VO2 Master, it allows us basically, we do measurements before dinner, we do it after dinner just to look at the thermic effect of foods, for example. We do it after training to see basically what happens there. And we even see that it even sometimes dips below normal resting levels, for example. Even we can only theorize on why that is happening, but the thing is that there's a couple of mechanisms that we just need to control, and we need to become even better at it. But back to a little bit to VO2 max and ISO. So why do I work on absolute values versus relative values? One of the things that we do see is that, first of all, Christian and Gustav now, they weigh 73, 74 for Gustav and 80 kilograms for Christian. And he's 175 tall. So you would almost say that, hey.
He's stocky, right? 175 centimeters at 80 kilos. He looks like a muscular guy. He's not a, he's not a beanpole. Yeah.
Exactly, but you'll also see that he actually a little bit of extra fat on his body compared to what you would expect to have from an elite athlete. But we can't look at it that way, because I'm not looking to build aesthetic machines.
No. It's performance. Velocity matters.
Pure. Exactly. And there, basically, again, when you make things relative, because if you look at a power number, so you can have two guys, for example, that has, let's say, 5 watts per kilogram. That over a certain, they're producing 5 watts per kilogram over a certain distance. But one of the guys is just moving much faster, everything equal. So aerodynamics would be equal, everything like that. But the problem is only that the raw power from a bigger guy that has 5 watts per kilogram is much higher power output, which basically then, if aerodynamics are the same, he will move much faster for this. And this goes the same also with VO2 max as well. If you look at relative values, okay, it's nice to have an idea of what kind of level people are at. But if you just want to look now purely at propulsion, then basically you have to look at it in absolute terms instead. Because most of the racing that is being done today is not very hilly. There are very few sports that are very hilly. And of course, if it starts to become very hilly, then of course, then you can start to say, okay, fine, now relative values will maybe give you a better predictor of the performance than necessarily than absolute values would give. So that's the main reason.
That's very interesting. So again, a couple of things. One is, in cycling, especially in the Tour de France, I've heard it stated, and the data for this are a bit confounded because they were based on the 2 decades of cycling when EPO was widely used. Every single top cyclist was using EPO. But that said, I think that still normalizes it and makes it clear. And basically, you could look at predictions of who would win the Tour absent a strategic blunder or an accident, and it was all predicated by functional threshold power in watts per kilo. So if you could know how many watts a cyclist could hold for 60 minutes divided by their weight, and you line those up in descending order, all things equal, that was going to be your championship finish. And of course, it's never exactly equal because, as I said, you can make a strategic blunder, there can be an accident, lots of things can happen. But I suppose that doesn't surprise you given the vertical nature of the Tour de France. It is mostly won in vertical distance, not horizontal distance.
Exactly. Just to add to that also, I think one problem there is a little bit when you talk about 60-minute power. So you take 60-minute power and you divide it by kilograms to make it relative. I think that then you are starting to get a fairly robust metric for it. The problem very often is that people use much shorter durations.
Right. They use 8-minute power, 10-minute power, and it's a very different bet. Yep.
And then the problem, if you now extrapolate that and you still call that functional threshold power, for example, and you divide it by your weight. What you don't know when you're looking at it this way is how much of energy comes from oxidative phosphorylation and how much comes from the glycolysis, for example. And the shorter the duration is, and you're extrapolating that up to a larger value,
the more dangerous it is metabolically. Yeah, let's actually make sure people understand why. If you're doing this analysis based on 5 minutes, to your point, what if during that 5 minutes, 80% of the energy was glycolytic, which is producing a lot of lactate? And we've just described, and we're going to come back to lactate. Lactate's great. It's the hydrogen that comes with it that's going to paralyze you. And so your 80% of that energy source, you will not be able to do that for 90 minutes or 60 minutes. But if you push the test out to 60 minutes, you can't fake it, basically. You will not be able to do an 80% glycolytic effort for 60 minutes.
Exactly. So there it becomes a really good predictor. But that's what I also like when people talk about, okay, my 60-minute power, this is my 60-minute power. That's extremely precise way of describing your capabilities, because then you at least you have a single point, or you have 2 points. You have a power and you have a duration that you're capable of holding in. And that gives you already a fairly good idea of the level of the athlete. Of course, if you start to have 2 data points now, so if, of course now maybe they are, you ask them also, what's your 5-minute
What's your
power?
30-minute? Or yeah.
Or 5-minute power, for example, because then you're already starting to get a slope as well. So you can start to even understand a little bit what kind of characteristics that is behind this athlete. So typically a sprinter will have a higher ratio between the 5-minute and 60-minute power, while a TT specialist would typically have a lower ratio between the 5-minute power and 60-minute power. Obviously, back a little bit to the maximum sustainable energy expenditure and VO2 max, why it's not necessarily a good predictor always of performance when you look at these long or these endurance events, simply because specificity becomes so important there as well. But this is, again, yes, I agree. When you talk about 60-minute power and you divide it by kilogram and you're using that to compare it across athletes in Tour de France, then it starts to become at least a pretty good metric to understand, or at least if I'm going to bet my money, it's a safer bet where you would go with the money looking at a higher number.
Yeah, when you go back to, again, because the data are most available when you actually go now and talk to cyclists like Lance Armstrong and Jan Ullrich and these guys, and they'll tell you. I mean, again, I think today cyclists are very guarded of those data, but back in the heyday of oxygenated performance-enhancing drugs, these guys were able to put out 6.5 watts per kilo for 60 minutes. And I think today people believe that they're they're able to do 5.5 watts per kilo for 60 minutes. So that's giving you a relative sense of the difference on and off these agents. I want to come back to another thing you said. Twice now you've alluded to less technical, more portable indirect calorimetry devices than what I'm used to in the lab if I'm doing a VO2 max test. Now, I was under the impression, and I'd love to be corrected here, that these portable devices are probably decent for measuring VO2, i.e. the consumption of oxygen, but their accuracy is sorely lacking for measuring VCO2, the production of carbon dioxide. And therefore, it might be a good tool for estimating VO2 max, but it's not a great tool for estimating total energy expenditure, which is calculated by using VO2 and VCO2, and nor is it a great tool for measuring fat oxidation, because there you must be able to look at a very accurate ratio of VCO2 and VO2. So are there devices out there that we could be buying that, you know, we could be testing ourselves on every month at home that would meet the criteria of being accurate enough in those domains?
Yes. So I think the accuracy of the devices are starting to become fairly good. We do very often back-to-back testing between the devices. So of course, in a laboratory setting, we are using mixing chamber system, which is of course is validated against many different methods.
Which system do you use in your lab?
So I am actually sticking still to an old system.
Which one, Parvo?
No, actually, no, not the Parvo. I'm actually using a Jaeger Oxycon Pro with a mixing chamber system.
Okay.
But I also really like the AEI Moxus as well, simply because it has some superior technologies in it compared to most of the other devices on the market. Most of the devices on the market, we're not going to go into this, but they're using, most of them are using galvanic fuel cells to measure oxygen, and then use infrared sensors to measure the CO2. But one of the things that for example, the AEI Moxus is doing is that it actually measures it using a zirconia cell instead. And zirconia cell is actually one of the most sensitive cells that we have. And you can't use it, for example, if you want to look at the photosynthesis, for example, you can't use a galvanic fuel cell because it's not sensitive enough, while a zirconia cell is sensitive enough. But nevertheless, the same technology now sits in the portable devices. So it's still using it. Also, the portable devices now are using galvanic fuel cells. We, of course, I mentioned the VO2 Master. One of the benefits we have had is that we enter into a partnership with them to advance the technology several years back. I did a screening on the market of all kinds of different metabolic or portable metabolic devices. What I am in need of is that I need to find a compromise. It doesn't help me necessarily to find a device that is a little bit more accurate than, for example, than the VO2 Master, for example, if the athlete doesn't want to use it because it has a rucksack and it has a lot of procedures, it is a horrible user interface and all this kind of thing. Then basically I bought a super nice device. I'm able to get the athletes to measure it 1 or 2 times, but that's not where the strength of data comes. The strength of data comes exactly from what you say. You need to measure regularly all the time there, and it has to be done in a way that the athlete doesn't feel it as intrusive or invasive into their lives.
So tell me a little bit about the VO2 Master, because I'm aware of some of the other portable devices, but not this one. So obviously the hallmark of this is you're going to be plugging the nose. You've got a mask that creates a perfect seal and therefore very clearly at a minimum can measure the air flow rate in and out, correct?
Yeah, so the thing is, actually you don't need to plug your nose. It actually uses a Hans Rudolph mask. So in most labs you'll very often see athletes are using these blue masks, more or less.
Okay.
So actually, so the cool thing is that what they did is that they actually designed a device that actually mounts on this Hans Rudolph mask that is around in the labs. And then basically what it does is the same as you do with a metabolic cart that sits in the laboratories. It has the galvanic fuel cells, because this is made by, maybe there are 5 manufacturers of galvanic fuel cells in the world. And basically everybody purchases from more or less these 5 different manufacturers there. So it's the same galvanic fuel cells that sits in the VO2 Master. And then basically the main differences between this device is that they have removed the turbine and they're using the same way of measuring flow that you do in Formula One and aerospace. So they use differential pressure instead to quantify the flow of what you're doing. So basically this is a device that just sits here. It's a headgear. There's no wires, there's no nothing. It's basically connects to your phone, watch, whatever that you have. And then basically this is how you now collect your oxygen consumption.
So I could go out for a bike ride. If I'm going to go and do VO2 max intervals and hill repeats, my favorite workout is the 4 to 5 minute hill repeat. I could be wearing this thing and that's it. And I come home and it's going to say, if I did 10 sets, it's going to tell me peak oxygen consumption per each set.
You can even connect it to your Garmin computer and you can go into your Garmin account and you can see it there, all the views. So you can see your breathing frequency, tidal volume, you can see your fraction of expired O2, your VO2, all the values basically combined there in the same, together with your power, with your velocity, with your position, everything there, like in one place. You don't need to look at like a separate report for your VO2 numbers and then basically looking at your Garmin numbers. Basically, they are overlaid.
So it's going to show me heart rate versus power versus VO2 at every moment in time.
Exactly.
And how accurately is it measuring VO2 relative to what you can do in the lab? And how about VCO2?
So VCO2 is, of course, that's a place where we have been very fortunate because we are a little bit ahead of the curve there. So we have had their device that has CO2 now for, this must be soon 2 years, I think.
The VO2 Master also does VCO2?
Yeah, in the prototype. This is probably going to be released to the market sometimes during next year. Then basically the whole market will have access to it.
I see.
So
okay.
we also have the CO2 capabilities as well. But yes, basically you can go out. How it compares with basically a metabolic cart. I think here there are 2 things to keep in mind. One is, of course, that measure of VO2 is a measure of VO2. So obviously they should on one side be the same. But one thing also, we know that between different devices, so the Oxyconn Pro, for example, we have the option to basically use it as a breath-to-breath device, or we can use it as a mixing chamber device. If you use it as a breath-to-breath device, then basically you're breathing straight through the turbine. That's it. So there's minimal resistance. Then, of course, on the other side, we can use the mixing chamber system, and then you have a 2.7 meter long hose now. And if you want to know, I can come back why it's 2.7 meters later on. But anyway, it's connected to a mixing chamber. And then basically what happens here is that the breathing resistance now goes up a little bit. And as we know also, breathing is not free either. Your lungs, in order to breathe, they also need energy. They need ATPs to contract or basically breathe. Simple as that. And basically, the more resistance there is to the breathing, the higher the oxygen consumption obviously will be. So you will actually see now for the exact same device, the exact same sensor, but just depending on the method they're using, that there will be differences between the two machines there. Simple as that. Further, when you go out and you actually do biking, one thing that is important to keep in mind there is that you are creating a very high headwind, most likely when you are going fast. Of course, you can go in a hill or these kind of things, and you bring down the velocity a big or to very low velocities, but you put out big power there. But what we have to remember is that any system that is based on measuring flow, and you now have an interference from basically flow reaching or hitting the turbine, hitting the VO2 master or any metabolic device there, will most likely also start to influence a little bit the numbers there. Because we have to remember also that we are not really measuring the flow, and we are not really measuring the total oxygen consumption. We are inferring it based on methods that are basically saying that when you're basically, we see that the turbine is rotating at this many RPMs per minute, for example, then basically we know that that correlates to a certain flow. So there will always be a little bit of uncertainties. And that's why, for example, when you're in a lab setting where basically you have no headwind, you have very controlled conditions and all these kind of things, the ability to get a higher accuracy will always be higher than it is out in the field. But then we know that what you do in the laboratory is still quite far from what you do out in the field, because you're already starting to limit the way that you're moving, the cooling. Yes, maybe you have a fan on this, but cooling will be different. There are a lot of things that already are different there. So the question is always, do you want accuracy of what really you are looking at, or do you are just looking at oxygen consumption, and then you create an artificial setting which is not necessarily representable for what you're doing? So it is a little bit of a give and take, where basically, yes, you give a little bit in one place, you lose maybe a little bit of, let's say, absolute accuracy from the device because you're introducing some more unknown variables there. But at the same time, you're looking at it now in real life conditions where you want to see, okay, what is it looking like here? And you get that accuracy in there, but on the compromise of absolute, let's say, measurement.
And how much of a difference are you seeing in one of your athletes between what you're doing gold standard on an ergometer in a lab versus if you put the mask on them and you make them go and do 4-minute hill repeats where the velocity is not that high, but they're probably still going, 18 to 20 miles an hour up a hill, pushing a massive gear to hit that VO2 max. How much of a difference are you seeing in the VO2 and the VCO2?
Between the two devices, so between
between the lab and the portable, the VO2 master.
Yeah. So again, there typically when we do back-to-back testing there between the two devices, we would see normally for Christian and Gustav, let's say difference of maybe 50 milliliters between the two devices.
That's it?
Yeah.
That's nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
I thought you were going to say 500 milliliters.
No, then we could just throw the device out the window. Then it has no value anymore. No, that wouldn't be acceptable.
Okay. But 50 milliliters of oxygen. And your guys are putting out you guys have an absolute of probably 6 liters. 7 liters. Oh my God. So yeah. So this is not even, this is understandably, it makes a difference at their level. But for someone at my level, and for most of the people listening here, a 50 milliliter difference is nothing. It's less than nothing. Yeah. So these things are really, this is so exciting to me, because I was under the impression that these devices were still so far away that they were not even worth entertaining the use of.
No. So one thing that, of course, you also start, which is a little bit interesting there, obviously, because we use mixing chamber system. That's where we come from. The whole, you'll ask the question if you think it's interesting to your listeners, whether they want to understand why there are mixing chamber systems and so on and so. But to spare them for that for now, basically what we do know is that when you have a mixing chamber system, it's just because you have a little bit the higher resistance in a system like that.
Yep.
Typically, we see also a more stable breathing pattern, just because they're actually they are being reminded more about exactly how they're breathing, because they feel a little bit more the resistance. What you do see is as a system gets less resistance, you'll naturally also start to see a little bit of more variation going up and down and these kind of things. Because even though, if you look at a power meter, people that are not used to ride with a power meter, they're only used to use heart rate, and you give them suddenly a power meter. The first time they get a power meter, they don't understand anything, because power goes all over the place there, because they are not used to focus on the power, and it becomes almost like they're chasing a number that is almost, they don't have the coordination or the skills to basically keep it and then basically find or relax around that very stable power and how to basically read it. Breathing is even worse. Breathing is even worse than power, because now you're even one order further away from performance. So velocity obviously is the first principle, first order. That's where exactly the performance happens. Power, you're one step further away, and this is of course a system that is very responsive as well to what you do. You won't necessarily see, like, if you suddenly get a spike, let's say you're riding 200 watts. If you went to 210 watts per second and back down to 190 to 200 watts, your speed wouldn't change at all. Your velocity would be the same, more or less, but still you have the volatility there. So if you now are using velocity as the gauge for whether a system is correct or not, you always say, hey, this cannot be correct. I went to 210 watts, it should be immediately giving me this. But again, the sensitivity to velocity, how the velocity is measured, is not good enough necessarily to capture the small changes that are happening intracyclic in the power production there, in between there. It's being smoothed out because of inertia, measurement weaknesses, and so on. This gets even worse when you get to velocity, because what we know is the body, exactly because of all.
You mean when we get to ventilation?
Yeah, ventilation. Yeah. So yeah, that's good clarification, because exactly we are measuring on the exhaust even here, and between basically where we are doing work and basically when we are breathing in and we are exhaling out again, there are so many compensating regulatory mechanisms in the body that are compensating for the lack in one place and here back and forth all the time, more or less, to make sure that we deliver energy as efficiently as possible to sustain that propulsion that we're doing. And now when you are measuring VO2 here, you can have quite a bit of fluctuation in this, and there are, let's say, kinetics involved here. So for example, one thing that people, to give an example, if you are running at, let's say you're running 15 kilometers per hour, and you have a certain oxygen consumption now at 15. So I'm just making up a number. Let's say that you are, or to use power, you're riding at a constant power, to make it simple, constant power of 300 watts. And you're consuming now 4.5 liters of oxygen. If you can still output that, those, did I say 300 watts? Yeah, 300 watts. You can still output those 300 watts there. But if you hold your breath now, what happens? VO2 comes down, ventilation comes down, or tidal volume and breathing frequency comes down. But you start to feel that something builds up in your body. You're still able to output those 300 watts there. At the moment you start, at some point, you either are forced now to stop, or you have to start breathing again. You're forced to start breathing again. And at the moment you start breathing again now, you have a huge depth in your body. And what will happen is that basically you get a huge spike in ventilation, huge spike in VO2. But what you also see is that when you break this down, is that obviously the big spike comes from both that you're driving a much larger tidal volume, breathing frequency goes up a lot, but also your fraction of expired O2. So the delta between how much of the oxygen you're consuming now, you are going much deeper than the 25% we said initially. But then basically, because things are not reacting extremely quickly on the exhaust part here, you'll see basically that here is almost like a regulator, like a PAD regulator that are trying to bring this back to that stable settings there. And it happens, okay, yes, your breathing comes down again, but still maybe you have a high VO2, and then suddenly VO2 undershoots a little bit because fraction of expired O2 comes up a little bit higher, but then says, this is not enough. This is too little oxygen, so I need to increase the extraction a little bit again before it comes back again. And this just tells to basically that, yes, 300 watts there, but you can still have a lot of variations there just by the fact that you're sitting on the bike and you're sipping that bottle there. You're holding your breath when you're sipping that bottle there. That will already influence your breathing and your VO2 for the next half minute on there. If you are swallowing, just the fact that if you start to have a lot of spit, for example, in your mouth and you're swallowing there, you are building a miniature depth there now that you have to pay for again afterwards there. So again, what one have to be careful about there, I don't like standardize and say you can't drink, you can't swallow, you can't do it. You have to be a machine, because that's not who we are. We have to learn to look past the noise of the data by collecting a lot of data and knowing exactly what people we are. We are not machines. Well, you could maybe say that we are machines as well, but there are so many things happening in between here that you can't necessarily, exactly like you also say.
Well, we're much more complicated machines, right? I mean, we talk.
Yes.
You've alluded to F1 twice now. That happens to be my favorite sport. And as much as we can look at those cars and say they are the most remarkably engineered things with wheels that have ever been produced, right? Everything from the engines that they build, these hybrid internal combustion engines, through the chassis and the aerodynamics. Again, most people are shocked to learn that the aerodynamics of that car are such that it can drive upside down at 100 kph. All of those things are remarkable. I still think we're far more complex. I mean, hands down, right? Because every element of that car can be modeled. There is an equation that explains every piece of it, whereas there is no equation to explain what you just described. And by the way, there's an element of chaos in that system. One thing that I'll suggest listeners try if they have power meters, and it's just a great example of what you said. So if you have a heart rate monitor and a power meter, next time you're on your bike, make a deliberate effort to change your ventilatory rate. So vent a lot and vent a little and watch what the heart rate does even as you hold the power constant. And of course, this is because that CO2 is very soluble, and CO2 is tracked by the brain very closely as a proxy for pH. And the body is very particular about keeping the pH at 7.4. And so as you slow down your ventilation rate and hold your breath, and your carbon dioxide levels rise and your pH falls, you will see that heart rate start to spike with no additional input in power output. And of course, the reverse is true. And it's just a great example of what you said, but it's one where you can sort of be the guinea pig and watch it. And it's just, you know, I still to this day get a kick out of playing that game to see how much I can move my heart rate just by interfering with my ventilatory rate.
But I can say that I think that that's also why some people become better also and others not, because I think that one thing that we very often tend to lose as we get older, or we go through, for example, different training, is that we lose that ability to play. Mm-hmm. And exactly going out and playing is one of the best ways to learn actually what influences and increase our awareness of that. Because one of the things is that I've learned with elites is that elites are not necessarily perfectly calibrated either. They need to actually be calibrated, because we have some athletes that typically, if you ask them to go out and do, call it a threshold workout, or let's say a workout that has, let's say, intervals, a combined duration of intervals that are between 60 to 80 minutes, and that should be fairly close to all out, or let's say to bring it to exhaustion on the last interval. You'll see that some athletes, elite athletes, they are ending up going out too hard, and they end up dropping the power towards the end. Some athletes, they go out a little bit too light, and they have to go really hard towards the end to bring it up there. But both scenarios, if you were able to keep it at a very calibrated or accurate level there, you would see that the total amount of kilojoules you were able to accumulate on those 80 minutes or 60 or 80 minutes or whatever the length there would be higher than if you ended up going progressive, or worst case, you ending up going regressive, because you go too hard in the beginning and are forced to come down towards the end there. But
what standard do you use, by the way? So let's use that as a quick example. So again, I said I'll use myself because I'm trying to get as much free coaching as I can here. So if I love doing my VO2 max sets on a bike, on a hill, and I have a fixed distance that I ride, so it really depends on the wind. So if I have a headwind, it'll take about 5 minutes. And if I have a tailwind, it could take, 3:45. That's how much the wind can play a role on this hill. But basically, it's not an all-out effort, because you want to be able to do it multiple times, but it's a very hard effort followed by about a 1-to-1 ratio of recovery. And that's the workout. After a warm-up, it's over and over and over and over again. And it's like an hour of doing that. Now, I typically, and I think this is because I've become softer in my old age, I typically ascend in power. So I will typically start out at a very conservative power where at the very end, I am not dead. But by the end, by the last one, I might be doing 10% more power than on the first set, and I'm absolutely at my limit. How would you recommend I change that? Would you recommend, like, you want that to be within 5% the whole way through, or how would you recommend that? If again, the goal is maximizing that workout to maximize VO2 max and to increase the engine size.
Yeah, well, maybe we should add one more dimension to this now, because I think that very often we confuse, for example, also when we talk about FTP, just FTP, and we black box a metric as FTP instead of saying 60-minute power or 20-minute power, whatever. What's really accurate with the 20, when you say 20-minute power, 60-minite power, you basically know that, okay, you can hold that power for that duration. That's the maximum, for example, before you basically end up dropping too much and you just call it David. Very often when we talk about VO2 max, it's very often confused with aerobic capacity, while in reality it's not. It's aerobic power. So basically what you're measuring there, you're measuring how much oxygen for let's say, for our undefined time. Yes, we have normalized it as milliliters per minute, but you can have a big range between athletes that has the same VO2 max. Some can do that for several minutes. Some can only do that for, let's say, 1 minute, for example. So now when you, and this is where the important is, because we're looking to provide signaling or a stimulus to the body. If you go out and you do 1 5-minute interval, more or less, then basically, okay, fine, that's the stimulus that you're providing yourself there. So this is about how, okay, you got a certain amount of time available to go out and do that VO2 max session today, for example. So let's say there's 90 minutes. Then basically, of course, now this is one-dimensional, because we're not talking only about a single workout as well. I think the most undervalued thing, which is not very sexy to talk about, and also the most undervalued thing, is that basically is consistency in the training over time. And that means that you need to leave a little bit in reserve there. And we haven't even touched on the topic of psychology yet either, because we are very much now talking about the things in physiology that we are good at measuring and these kind of things, but there are also plenty of things that we are not able to measure. And even the things that we like to say that we are so good in stoichiometry, or we're so good in understanding metabolic pathways or signaling pathways, there's still things added to this where we basically understand that no, we don't. And then we haven't even dived into the topic of microbiome, or basically how basically we are, it's a undiscovered world that we are basically taking on now. So one of the things that is that when you're doing this exercise, then I think that, but the good thing with VO2 is that, of course, that we're measuring a quantity, we're measuring a volume of something. It's much in the same way when we talk about power versus work. So you talk about work, for example. So when you say, to make this a little bit more practical, so when you say, okay, I want to basically do my VO2 max workouts, I go a little bit progressive. I would normally say that's a good thing to do, because also what happens is there's a priming effect also happening in the body as well. So if you go out like where you think that you maybe would be able to sustain throughout the workout, you might figure out that you still are able to go a little bit higher. At some point, it's the opposite. But one thing that we have done multiple times over the last half decade is that very often people think that, okay, when I've done a VO2 max effort, then basically I'm done. I won't be able to repeat that. I need 2 days of rest, or maybe a week of rest, or whatever, before I can do that. That's not true either. We know that, for example, if you do a VO2 max effort and then basically you give an adequate time of rest in between there, you are able to go even harder on the next one now, even though that was completely to exhaustion on the first one. Completely.
So let's say more about that. So put some time and numbers to it so I can understand what you're saying. So you could take one of your athletes, and what duration of an interval would you have them push to?
So, for example, here, let's say that we are using an old-fashioned way of quantifying VO2 max. So you just say that you do a graded exercise test. So you increase the power by 5%, for example, every minute that goes there until you basically come to exhaustion.
Yes.
So let's say that now that the athlete finishes around 500 watts and around 7 liters of oxygen.
And for the listener, those are world-class numbers that are obscene. Like you're not running into people on the street that can do that, but carry on.
Yeah, and here already I haven't told what's happening before there as well, because if I only took them fresh doing this, then the power number would be different. So again, this comes back a little bit to talking about power at VO2 max, where this is already manipulated depending on what you've done before this as well. So now basically they do this. So let's say that they last for 6 minutes, and then if they finish the last one on, let's say 500 watts, 500 last minute on 500 watts, maybe they go a couple of seconds longer into the next one. And this is also important. So when you do a great exercise test, if you come to the next step now and you feel that, oh, this is too hard, push as long as you can, because every second count there, because it's more work. It's more oxygen consumed there. Strongest stimulus, more or less. I wouldn't advise doing this very often, but we can come back to that a little bit later, because I'm not a big fan of doing very often like 2 exhaustion workouts. That you should put them in very sparingly into your program, and that ties back to consistency. But anyways, now given in between there, let's say if we give 10 minutes of rest in between there now, a little bit more rest in between there, then basically if you do now a new VO2 max, you'll bring the athlete up to the same athlete. We bring now to more than 7 liters, so 7.1, or maybe even a little bit higher. And power output is also now, for example, comes up now maybe 1 more minute at one higher power output. So now we are already at maybe 525 watts for 1 minute as well.
And you're saying that that's happening because they've been primed by the first set to be able to do that with only 10 minutes of rest?
If it goes too long rest in between there, then basically you start to lose the effect. So if the duration of the rest in between there, then you are not able to draw the effect of that anymore. That can be, I think you could probably extend it up to 15 or maybe 20 minutes. But when you get past 20 minutes, then I would be a little bit, I'm not so sure whether that would hold true anymore. So it needs to be short. And this can also come back to, because we know also that oxygen, when we think about hemoglobin as well, the affinity of oxygen and CO2 to the hemoglobin is also affected by the temperature of the blood or the body and the hemoglobin as well. So this is also improving actually with a higher temperature than it is at a cola. So when you get 20 minutes, obviously temperature of your body will also come further down, come longer down than it is at 10 minutes. 10 minutes, it will also come down, but maybe not as much. But the most interesting thing that happens also now is the RER value is heavily skewed towards oxygen consumption and less carbon dioxide production. So you would even, when you do this, you would even say that this doesn't qualify for a VO2 maxes. So the VO2 numbers now are equally high or higher, but the carbon dioxide production is actually now just maybe a little bit higher than 1 in RR value. And normally we would say that if you just went by the papers or the old school books, you would say that, okay, in order for qualify a VO2 max, you should, for example, one of the criteria is often they say that you need to exceed an RR value of 1.1, for example, for it to be valid. Of course, what you're going to say? The VO2 max value was higher. Are we now going to disqualify it? It was a higher oxygen consumption than it was on the previous one. It's also equally more now.
Let's explain this to people, because you and I already alluded to this very briefly, but we didn't make a big point of it. So the RER is calculated instantaneously at any moment in time as the ratio of VCO2 to VO2. So let's go back to you're going to put one of your athletes on the bike, and he starts riding really slowly. In that moment, what is his? He's at 100 watts, so he's not even breaking a sweat. What is his RER at that moment?
One more time. Which power?
100 watts. He's just starting out.
The thing is that this is actually a little bit funny, because here it's very easy when we look at the values. When you look at RER, we typically look at a ratio of concentration, and we now already exclude a little bit the volume of oxygen and volume of CO2 that is there. And of course, there's a requirement for a certain amount of energy to be turned around per time. That's why, for example, if you look at lactate as a surrogate. Because we can, again, if you go back all the way to stoichiometry, and we already said C6, H12, O6, glucose broken down to lactate and these kind of things, we already know here how much CO2 that is being produced in this process there at certain ratios. But since we also know the ratio between glucose and lactate as well, we can use that also as a surrogate to have more or less the same confirmations as well, or the same indications as well. The difference is only that VCO2 is a volumetric measurement, while lactate is a concentration metric, and concentration metrics are influenced by many other factors as well. So that's why lactate can be a little bit more unpredictable, and it's not as a good indicator as VCO2 is. But coming back to that, basically at 100, typically there you won't see necessarily a very good ratio between VO2 and VCO2. So our value that can actually be quite high, because two things that are playing into account there. Your resting metabolic rate already plays a much bigger factor, or a relatively larger percent of the total oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide production now, as opposed to when you start to go to a higher number. So the higher the number are, the smaller the percentage of the resting, because when we measure VO2 and VCO2, we measure actually the gross oxygen and gross CO2 product. We're not measuring only oxygen as a function of exercise, but actually of both exercise.
Yes, and basal resting. Okay, so now this, of course, is going to be heavily influenced by their diet and the carbohydrate content of their diet, but I'm assuming your athletes are on a pretty high carbohydrate diet. So that means, so that means that their resting RER is probably 0.85 to 0.9.
Or higher.
Okay. So that means that they get a nadir in their RER when energy expenditure gets high enough that it starts to dwarf basal energy expenditure, and you're really achieving maximal fat oxidation, which is probably occurring at, I don't know, about 75, at a wattage that probably corresponds to 75 or 80% of their best 1 hour power. I'm guessing that in and about that wattage, they are at maximum fat oxidation, and they probably are at minimum RER.
So actually, it's even higher for endurance athletes, or especially triathletes or long course triathletes, because this comes back also a little bit to, now we are getting a little bit deeper into it, but this also comes back to why it's not necessarily VO2 max a good predictor of performance, especially the longer the events becomes. So for example, to let people in on a little bit of a, let's call it
secret sauce.
Yes, it's no, not secret sauce, but secret. And that is that actually for Christian and Gustav to win the world championships in last year, basically we had a consequence of the specialization we did. VO2 max came down significantly. So from them basically racing in the Olympics, clocking in, so using relative values, which is maybe a little bit more easier to relate to. Both Christian and Gustav would typically test in around, let's say, close to 90 milliliters per minute per kilogram. But at Ironman, in order to set new records in Ironman, we had to bring it down to actually below 80 milliliters per minute per kilogram.
And you did this purely because of energy demand and energy consumption?
And purely because you can't sustain, because think of it more like a curve, more or less, where you have a curve. That
you had to detune the engine, basically. You had to bring the fuel flow rate and oxygen flow rate in the engine down to do Le Mans versus do a Formula One race.
Exactly, and that basically, because you can't now prioritize doing those 5-minute power surges or micro intervals anymore, because it's too far away from basically what you need in an Ironman, and you need to build more, let's say, towards the higher energy demands, or let's say higher power outputs in an Ironman, the lower ones or the sustainable ones, and so on, and maybe even building a little bit longer as well. So you basically don't have the time anymore, or basically that's not right. You have the time, but you actually are not able to consume enough energy over weeks and months to sustain a program that allows you to both increase your VO2 max at the same time as you're building up that long duration power output. Or let's say that 4-hour power as well.
I think what would be interesting for folks to understand is, so there's something called the Wick equation, which tells us the relationship between energy consumed and oxygen consumed and CO2 produced. Now, I used to know it off by heart, but I think it's basically energy expenditure is 3.75 times VO2 in liters per minute plus 1.25 times VCO2 in liters per minute. Does that sound right?
Actually, I would make it even simpler, because basically we know that from 1 milliliter of oxygen, basically there's a 20 joules, there are 20 joules of energy being, and then we know already, as you already said that, well, the efficiency of the body is approximately 20% propulsive and 80% are thermal. So you can actually do this far simpler in that sense, that you can just look at, okay, how many milliliters of oxygen you are consuming, and multiply it actually but just by 20.
Okay, so
yeah.
at 6 liters per minute of VO2, and I guess the reason you can make that simplification is by the time you're at 6 liters of VO2, you can assume what VCO2 is. You don't have to measure it. The approximate, let me just do the math. So that's about that's 30 calories per minute of energy consumption. 1,800 calories per hour of energy consumption at 6 liters per minute. And at that point, you now exceed the capacity of the human digestive system. There is no means by which a human in any form can ingest 1,800 calories in an hour and actually get those calories out of the gastrointestinal system into the circulatory system, into the muscles. So really, at this level, it becomes an energetic problem as much as a problem of stroke volume, heart rate, and, you know, capillary efficiencies.
And you can even say that you don't even care about heart rate or stroke volume or cardiac output anyway, because that's exactly back to what you even started with, which also resonates so well with me. VO2 encompasses exactly that stroke volume, because cardiac output is just a function of VO2 in the end anyway. Because what you really need, the cardiac output is just like to supply you with oxygen. Really, it's the oxygen which is let's say the key metric here. So again, yes, it's the energetic demand becomes so crazy that you just have to start to prioritize, and you just say that, okay, how important is it for you to be able to do like super high 5-minute watt surges in Ironman? Not important at all.
Yeah.
Never. Exactly. So you can't spend time on training it. If you could feed more energy, so if you somehow would be able to even feed more energy, yes, then you can definitely uphold more of that. And that's, of course, what we did there. We looked exactly at how can we stay in this perfect balance there, living at the edge, where we can keep the VO2 max as high as possible, or let's say the whole curve as high as possible, because that in the end will give us a better ability to race than necessarily our competitors setting records.
Now, given these huge energetic differences, you know, let's just make sure people understand the distances we're talking about. At the Olympics in Paris next, you know, July or August, it's an Olympic distance triathlon, so we won't need to go into the distances, but let's just tell people a world-class athlete is doing that in what, an hour and 40 minutes, or maybe even less at this point? Where are they?
No, 140, 145 is basically where you need to be. And that's basically 51.5 kilometers, 1,500 meters swimming, 40 kilometers biking, and then basically 10 kilometers running.
Conversely, if you look at Ironman distance at the other end of the spectrum, we're 2.4 miles in the water, 112 on the bike, full marathon run. The world-class guys are doing that in, what, 7.5 hours, 7:40-ish?
Yeah, 7.5. Christian went 7:21 on the fastest. So yeah, but 7:30 is a good.
Again, it's simply unfathomable to anybody who's done any of those things that they're going that fast. But the energy demand, if you're trying to do something all out for an hour and 40, that is a much easier fueling strategy than if you have to go at a submaximal effort for 7.5 hours. So is it surprising to you that you can have one athlete who can be exceptional and world-class at both? Because I have to be honest with you, it's a little counterintuitive to me, based on this discussion, that you could be the best in the world at both of those. Is there another sport where we would see such disparity? Like we wouldn't expect that the best 400-meter runner is also going to be the best 10K runner. And we wouldn't expect that the best 5K runner would be the best marathoner.
So this is where I think that we have hugely benefited from using science, because it allowed us to break down the Ironman distance and understand where basically we could gain much more time than what had been done before. Because what we have to think is that the training, let's say the method for training, we can come back a little, because you mentioned the 5-minute intervals and how you were executing this to basically do your VO2 max session. We can come back to that, because this is also, if you're thinking of it, we are organic creatures, so we respond to stress by normally getting stronger, given that we are providing the conditions to allow it to grow stronger. So now, basically, when you are out and you are doing your 5-minute efforts, and you have a finite time, if you have a finite amount of time that you can do this exercise. So let's say you had 90 minutes. Now, basically, you can twist this around instead and say that in the same way that you go out and you play a little bit with your breathing to see what you can do with your heart rate at a certain power. Now you can just say that, okay, fine, I'm actually now looking to provide the maximum amount of stimulus to increase my VO2 max. We already said that, for example, 5-minute power or 3-minute power is a good proxy or surrogate to understand how high your VO2 max is. Now think of it this way instead, that when you go out, you're looking actually to accumulate the maximum amount of work that you can do at a certain output. That is actually a better way of looking at how can I actually here provide the best possible stimulus for me now to grow my engine, to grow my VO2 max. And you might
Sorry, just to be clear, you're saying you might go out and say, for an hour, what's the most number of kilojoules that I can expend, as opposed to what's the highest VO2 max I could sustain for that period of time? Are you basically saying we should just use kilojoules, or we could just use kilojoules as the metric?
Yeah, because you can think of it this way, that the further away we are from, because in the end, you can say that, okay, velocity is the ultimate measurement of
yes.
performance. Yeah, and the further away we move from this, the more gray it becomes, because there are more mechanisms compensating, and that has an influence on what is happening there. So we could think of it this way, that, okay, the reason why we want to grow an engine is because we want to become faster on the one side. But then when you go out, you are not measuring VO2 max when you're not measuring milliliters per minute or how much oxygen you're consuming when you're doing your exercise now. But we know that the higher intensity you go, the more oxygen you will consume per time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then we are saying that now we are providing a stimulus to the body to say that we need more oxygen. You need to respond to this and basically facilitate this moving forward, because this guy, he might be crazy enough to go out and do this session again next week or something like this. So again, the theory of supercompensation. That's why normally we would say that, okay, the reason why we get stronger is because we exercise, or we provide a controlled stress to the body that the body is able to respond to and grow from. So now when you're out and exercising and you're doing these hill repeats there, now you can instead think of it this way. Okay, so when I did my 5-minute efforts, and let's say you accumulated, how many repeats would you do during an hour? Or let's say, how many repeats would you do during the session?
6 to 10.
6 to 10. So then basically when you do 6 to 10, that means basically then you are accumulating between 30 to 50 minutes of, let's say, that high intensity.
Of work, yes, that's right.
Of work there. Yep. So of course you do more work, but you do that specific work there with the idea of that this will give you a bigger engine, but ultimately actually what you're really looking for is to become faster. That's what you're really looking for. And that can be done, like we also mentioned initially as well. If you, in one sense, you could say you don't really care either. If your VO2 max comes down, but you just come faster, okay, well, efficiency have increased, but okay, that's most likely not going to be the ratio. The outcome of it will probably be a mix between a lot of things here. But now you can think of it this way, and that is that when you go out and you do, so let's say that you ride now at 400 watts and you accumulate 30 minutes at 400 watts. So let's say something like that.
Those days are over, by the way.
Okay.
that used to be the case. I'm nowhere. I wish I could still do 400 watts for 5 minutes, but anyway.
Let's say 300 watts. It doesn't matter. Yeah. It doesn't matter. 300 watts, and this is close to exhaustion. Close to exhaustion. You have a little bit of reserve, so you can repeat this. Yeah. And like you say, you have enough even in reserve that you even are able to progress throughout the session a little bit on this. So let's say that now you're accumulating in average at 310 watts, you accumulate 30 minutes, 30 minutes of work around there. And now, what if you could accumulate? Because if you go to 50 minutes, a normal consequence of this would not normally be that either now you have gotten fitter, or you just had a lot more in reserve when you do the 30 minutes and you really didn't bring yourself close to exhaustion at all. So then the stimulus and then the stress on the body is also much less. And worst case, if you were capable of doing now 50 minutes, accumulating 50 minutes at 300 watts or 310 watts, for example, 2 weeks ago, if you now do it only for 30 minutes, that's already detraining of the ability to stay at 300 watts if you do too many of these sessions now moving forward, unless you only use this one as a way to just provide some adaptation or make yourself ready for something bigger to come forward. But now you can look at it another way. So let's say, again, 300 watts, 300 watts, 30 minutes, that's approximately where you're sitting, or 310 watts, 30 minutes, that's approximately where you're sitting, then you're close to exhaustion. But the session, the time you got available for this training that you had there now, maybe that was like 60 minutes, or let's say that, or to ask you, how long are these sessions lasting typically from basically when you start and to you stop the session in total?
Yeah, not that much longer, because the warm up and the cool down is 20 minutes in total. So it's most of the set. Like, I could be door to door from my house in 75 to 90 minutes easily.
Okay, but brilliant. So basically here we're talking about 75 to 90 minutes in total of a training time available. And then you are putting in now, let's say
it's very different. So just to be clear, when I used to train, like I exercise now, I don't train. When I used to train, my coach on the really big days would sometimes want me to not begin the VO2 max set until I had done 2,000 kilojoules. So I would go out and do a relatively kind of easy, like a 200 watt, 2,000 kilojoule ride, and then finish with a very big main set of hill repeats, short hill repeats, so 6-minute hill repeats. And so that was an enormous total amount of energy expenditure, but most of it was actually at like zone 1 to zone 2. Pure aerobic efficiency, and then finishing with the VO2 max. Again, I don't remember what the rationale was for where get those 2,000 kilojoules of work in before you go there, but those were much longer days, obviously. And again, today, because I'm not training, for me personally, velocity doesn't matter anymore, nor does power. Frankly, I'm only training for the conditioning of it, right? I'm basically asking the question, how long can I keep my VO2 max high? One of the things I think about is, at what age will my VO2 max in relative terms, mils per kilogram per minute, be smaller than my age in numbers? It's an interesting question. Where do we make that crossover?
Yeah, no, I think this is also something that we will probably have a completely new picture of also over the next 5 to 10 years as well, just because a lot of measurement equipment that we have available becomes more democratized. One thing I can also say is that from all the data, I collect so much data on my athletes as well. And also many of the coaches I work with, they collect so much data on the athletes. But the problem is that we even see that we can use the data to even make the athletes faster. So we even haven't gone as fast as it is possible to do yet. But the time that is available to basically analyze all these metrics and bring it back into our sound program is so time consuming to do that you sometimes just have to skip this and you have to focus on the more important part of it. So one of the things that we are doing is that we are building, we have a company called Enthalpy, and where we basically are building so AI, but of course LLMs or natural language processing systems and numerical models, where we basically allow us to start to utilize even more of this data in order to provide even more deeper individualization for athletes. But even when you go out and basically exercising and you're looking at, we can break this even further down, because again, your ability to put out 300 watts, for example, is also a function of force and circumferential velocity, or let's say torque and cadence. because it's very easy sometimes when you go out and you're thinking that, okay, now I'm going to go max, that what you feel is the torque. You don't feel the power in the same way, you feel really the torque. But if you aim for something that really feels like super heavy, there's a big torque, but it doesn't necessarily yield a very high power or power output at all.
Right.
And power is basically what drives the energy demand for the body. It's not the torque in the same way. Of course, it's not entirely, it's a mix of a little bit of the two, but
do you subscribe to the idea, again, using this example, where if you shift more towards higher torque, lower velocity, you're putting more of the stress on the musculature of the legs? If you switch more towards a higher velocity, by velocity I mean crank velocity, lower torque, you're switching more of the demand in the direction of the cardiovascular system. I mean, remember, people used to talk about this all the time between Lance and Jan, right? One was pushing 95 to 100 RPM. The other was pushing 65 to 70 RPM. They're putting out the same power, but two different strategies. Do you think about that distinction for the cyclist?
Again, yes. Well, yes, I do. And this is also something that's very easy to measure. So, for example, if you're out and you put on a VO2 master and you go for a certain power output and you drop, for example, that cadence, so you bring up the torque.
That's right. That's right. You can basically make VO2 the metric that helps you decide, and that should correspond most to fatigue.
Exactly.
That's a good point.
Well, actually, the interesting thing is that what you see now is that you might actually bring down the VO2 as a function of that you're increasing the torque. So you get a little bit better ratio there. But what can happen actually as a function is that you also see that CO2 comes up a little bit more. So you actually are shifting a little bit.
Shifting the substrate. That's right.
Exactly. Yep. So, and of course, the mechanism behind this is probably also like it's fairly easy to rationalize, and simply because when you are starting to use a higher torque, you are activating a larger cross-sectional area of your muscles. So you're also recruiting more type 2 fibers versus only type 1 fibers as well.
Right. So you're becoming much more glycogen dependent as you make that recruitment. Yeah.
It's not entirely black-white like that, but in general, yes. But also here you can say that, because then we're thinking, okay, but we have heard about the expression slow twitch and fast twitch fibers, and fast twitch, doesn't that normally, should more of that be activated when you start to pedal faster? And well, yes, but you're not even approaching the limit of basically a slow twitch fiber or type 1 fiber contractile velocity when you're at 90 or 100 or 110. It's more a pure limitation of coordination, or being able to coordinate your pedaling motion in order to have a better balance between your gross power and your net power. And this is basically where people sometimes they forget, is that what happens is that you start to go at a higher cadence. If you now actually measure your gross power and your net power, you start to see that yes, the net power is the same, but the gross power actually starts to go up when you're starting to bring up your cadence as well, which tells why the VO2 now also starts to go up, because the VO2 or the oxygen consumption doesn't care about your propulsive power. It cares about how much power is required.
That's right.
Now.
It's counting both the usable and wasted energy.
Exactly. So this is one thing that you see is the slow. If you go with a little bit lower cadence, typically what happens is that you have it's easier to coordinate your pedaling motion versus, for example, when you start to go with a higher cadence. But that's why even when you start, if you do, let's say you do a graded exercise test, if you aim for a low, or let's say a low torque, the problem is there as the ergometer basically now starts to force you to go to higher power, and you go with a low cadence. This will basically start immediately to increase the motor unit activations. You're recruiting more and more of muscle fibers, and you won't be able to get up to an equally high power output, simply because the limitation that comes in now is that you have no more motor units, you have no more muscles to recruit anymore, and you are forced to a stop. The only way now to compensate for this is that you have to bring up your cadence instead as a function, because if there's no more muscles to recruit there, well, then only thing you can do is start to work faster instead, or bringing up the cadence faster. Okay, we ventured a little bit further out, let's say, off the track here. So to bring it back again to your question a little bit about, okay, so you're looking to conditioning and or creating the fundament or the ability to put out a big power there. again, we know that power is a very good, extremely good. There's a very good correlation between power and VO2. Obviously, more work, more oxygen consumption. Simple as that. And this is also this is a curve. You can almost say it's a linear relationship. So if you increase your power by 10%, you will normally increase your oxygen consumption by 10% as well. For those people that are really into the pudding here, of course, they understand that this is not entirely the case. This is a curve linear relationship, but for the simplicity, we keep it this way for now. So now what you're doing...
And just to complete that, you will not increase velocity by 10% in that situation because of the relationship, the square relationship between velocity and drag. So just so folks understand, while those two things are moving up in a curvilinear relationship, the velocity relationship is actually a squared or a power relationship. And therefore, it gets harder and harder when you're talking about athletes at the level that you're coaching to eke out an additional kilometer per hour when they're already going 48 kilometers per hour. It becomes seismic to try to add 5% to that.
Exactly. So then back a little bit to you. So then back to your question. Here you can think of it this way. Since we know that there is a fairly good correlation between, or not a fairly good, is an extreme good correlation between power and oxygen consumption. Now you can think of it this way. Okay, so how can I then increase my oxygen consumption? Because now we're not talking about milliliters per minute. Now we are talking about milliliters accumulated. So in the same way we talk about power and the relationship between power and work, we can talk about also the difference between milliliters per minute and milliliters per, let's say, session, for example. So then we can think of it this way. Okay, so how do I provide a stronger stimulus to let's say, to the cardiovascular system, respiratory system, to everything, so to basically I get a higher VO2 max? Well, I would then say that, okay, you have already a power meter, so you already have something that we know have an extremely close relationship with oxygen. So how can we now increase the total oxygen consumption during that session there? Then basically, I would probably argue that saying doing 5 minutes on, 5 minutes off, for example, will not necessarily yield the maximum work that you can do at that, because we're not looking at total work during the session, because obviously that would be better if you brought down the intensity in total. Right. But now you're looking for the specific. You want to increase that maximal oxygen output. So we're now looking at something that sits in this range there. There's high intensity. So I would rather here look at it more like go out and play a little bit and look a little bit, okay, what kind of intervals do I have to do here to pack as much as possible kilojoules of work here at that power outputs during that session that you got available. And I'm pretty sure if you do this over a month and you go back into the lab and you test your VO2 max, you'll already see now that you have a higher VO2 max than what you did have before.
And just to give a sense of what some of those games could look like, because again, I used to experiment with every type of interval from 30 seconds on to 30 seconds off up to 8 minutes on, 8 minutes off. So it was always, the only thing that was constant was the 1-to-1 work to rest ratio. But as I just alluded to, right, it could be, the work to rest could be as little as 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes.
Less.
Yeah.
Or even less, yeah.
And so what is your intuition? Because again, the classic thinking, classic cycling physiology is maximizing VO2 max and maximizing PVO2 max, powered VO2 max, critical power, for example, is going to be attained at 3 to 8 minute intervals. Now, it doesn't mean you don't improve the engine size when you're doing intervals less than 3 minutes or more than 8 minutes, but that you're most efficient in your training time at those intervals. Are you arguing that's not necessarily true? There could be gains outside of that if you're using maximum kilojoules per unit time as your metric.
Yeah, accumulated inside a session. Yeah, because we again think of it this way: we are looking for a stimulus. So to again make it, or to be a little bit blunt, crude, you can think of it. If you do 1 minute, if you do 5 minute interval, and that's the only thing you do, the stimulus that you are providing now at, let's say, P VO2 max or power at VO2 max, for example, or let's say you had an oxygen mask and you could measure now your oxygen uptake. You will see that the total accumulated oxygen that you have been using now during that session is very, very little. So the reason for why you do intervals, and you don't try to do, for example, if you try to not do it even as intervals, you even try to just combine those 30 minutes into one power output at all, you won't be able to put out the same amount of power if you just did it in one go, 30 minutes there. Probably then you would be forced to do maybe to bring it down to 280, 270, if it was 300, for example, watts when you did it as 5-minute intervals, maybe even more down. Now we can think of it this way, in the same way. We can just bring it down to, so why 5 minutes? Well, why did you land on 5 minutes? Well, could it also be 4, for example? Could it be 3? Could it be 2? Because what we're really looking at here is how the maximum.
But we want to make sure we don't make the interval too small, that we're quote unquote cheating and using pure glycolytic power, which obviously has its benefits, but won't necessarily increase, presumably at some level, mitochondrial function and mitochondrial throughput. I mean, we really, because we're so focused on VO2 max here, we want to make sure we're increasing both. We're increasing an energy system that is flexible enough to oxidize both glucose and fatty acid through the mitochondria, and therefore with oxygen. So at some level, don't those interval durations get so short that we can be misled by what we're seeing, assuming we don't have the oxygen mask? So if we have the oxygen mask, of course, we'll notice that. But if we're only relying on power, that correlation between power and VO2, that linear curve starts to separate in lower durations, doesn't it?
So basically, again, I think one thing to bring in here. So disclaimer, which is very important to think. I think that there's no like single workout that is the golden workout. We need different kind of stimulus, because like when you do different kind of, let's say, intervals at VO2 max, they will elicit different functions in your body or different benefits in your body. For example, if you do micro intervals, one of the things that might be there is that you won't necessarily bring your core temperature as high up as you would do if you do a longer prolonged workout, for example. And we know that also, for example, one thing that's very beneficial to our body is to have more plasma. More plasma is good for us. And we also know that that also has an influence on VO2 max as well, for example. So like bringing up the core temperature, and let's say also like working on fatigue or being able to focus on relaxing when you get more fatigue in your body as you're doing longer intervals. There are many benefits of doing longer intervals as well. But now we are purely looking at one thing here. So we just said, okay, fine, let's see how can we bring the VO2 max the highest. And we disregard everything else. We don't talk about necessarily about endurance, fatigue resistance, all these kind of things that we just neglect that for now. So now you can think of it this way: that what is the driving? What is it that causes us to bring up the oxygen? Why does it come up? Here, I think it is useful to think of also what is the measurement method that we're using as well, very often to quantify this. And we have to remember that this oxygen apparatus, when we are measuring oxygen consumption, we are not measuring what's happening inside the muscle. We are measuring what comes out in the end in the exhaust here. And then we are quantifying VO2 max as a function of that. If we go into, so for example, if you do mitochondrial respiration, so if you take the mitochondria, so you do a biopsy, you take out now the mitochondria and you put it into chambers, specific chambers is to measure now the mitochondrial respiration. We are not talking about 90 milliliters per minute per kilogram anymore. We know that already for not well-trained athletes, you're already at 200 milliliters per minute per kilogram. We know that for elites, you are more than 300 to 500 milliliters per minute per kilogram if you go into what the mitochondria is capable of using of oxygen there.
Sorry, just to make sure we understand that, Olav, what you're saying is we are never limited at the level of the mitochondria.
I would say, statistically speaking, so if you're not talking about people,
I mean, not talking about people with mitochondrial disease, but if you're talking about you and me and your athletes and most of the people listening to this, when we ask the question, where is the rate limiting step in oxygen consumption, or more to the point, oxygen utilization, it is not at the mitochondria. It's not that we are unable to put more oxygen through the system at the final point where it is needed for combustion. By the way, I've always thought it's at the level of stroke volume. that it's actually at getting the plasma to the muscle. Is that what you believe?
Yeah, getting the blood, getting the oxygen, getting the hemoglobin transported to the cells is the most important thing, more or less. So it's basically is more of a central limitation than a peripheral limitation we're talking about there, because the peripheries, where if you look at it, for example, from mitochondrial perspective, it is so. The ratio between what it can use is so extreme compared to what we are able to pump around or take up in our lungs and pump around to the body compared to what we can use. So then, and that's actually not without touching into that. That actually goes also from when we look at it. For example, you mentioned that my athletes are using a lot of carbohydrates for fueling and so on. We also know that basically the 60 to 90 grams per hour, that's not a limitation either. It's much, much, much higher than that. We use this. So how do we quantify this? We use isotope tracers. So we add isotope tracers to the carbohydrate, and then basically similar concept as double label water, but here we add it actually to the carbon instead to look at the carbohydrate uptake. So we know that is much higher. This is a lot of research that we have done with Morten, specifically on Christian and Gustav. And we know that, again, if you do muscle biopsies, then we see basically that the carbohydrate uptake is so much higher than what we are able to supply through our system. So again, it is a supply problem.
So sorry, meaning you're limited in what the gastrointestinal tract can tolerate, not at the substrate utilization in the mitochondria.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be I'm going to be very crude there, but we can put it this way. What brings us to VO2 max? It's not because we're thinking that we want to have a high VO2 max. Oh, now I want to. You can start to breathe, increase your ventilation now as high as you want, but you won't increase. You will increase your oxygen uptake.
Right, but you'll never get to your maximum level without sufficient work. You need work.
Exactly, not even close to it. You will bring it up, but you will not be just because you're breathing more and you're working more when you're doing that. But then coming back to micro intervals and whether this is glycolytic or not, I think that if you go into the muscles and you measure in the muscles, you'll see that basically what happens there is that basically muscles are trying to use absolutely all basically energy systems immediately, instantly. But because we have a lot of buffer mechanisms in our body, if the burst is short enough, then basically it won't show up as something here because you are basically just feeding it to the body. And then basically you have a long taper, or let's say you will never get a spike in VO2, but you can see that you have an elevated VO2 consumption over a little bit longer time. If you measure longer, if you just measure during the interval, it won't show up on the exhaust because you take off the mask before it basically shows up there. But if you keep the mask on now and you keep it on there for, let's say, a couple of minutes after, you'll see that now that basically you have an elevated oxygen consumption compared to before you did that interval there. So basically we can say that when you do a burst, it will use most likely all energy systems instantaneously, all of them as much as possible. Because I think like if you say that, okay, now it's first ATPs, first we use stored ATPs and then we shift to PCR and then it becomes glycolytic and then basically we go off to beta oxidation. This is rather more, I think the more correct way to view this, basically the reason why you can have a high power output, short and high power output, is because you are able to supply from all the energy systems instantaneously, but then you're depleting the different energy systems.
Then all of a sudden the phosphorylated creatine comes down immediately and then the glycolytic and then and that's where that makes sense.
Yeah. So now basically coming back then to micro intervals versus longer intervals, as long as you start to accumulate enough work during that session there, because we also talk about VO2 and VCO2. VCO2 is really what is really useful for is to get an instantaneous picture of course, what kind of substrates are you using, and whether you are at an RIR value of, let's say, even 0.8 or even, let's say, below 0.8, for example. But let's say that you are 0.8 or you're 0.9 or you're 1 in RIR value. Basically, it doesn't make that much of a difference in your energy yield. So 1 milliliter of oxygen, if you use 20 joules of energy, 20 joules as as a number to basically understand your energy demand there, you won't go very wrong whether you had been using. So if you put this into the formula and you start to look, okay, how much big of a difference it is there, it's not a massive difference. Yes, there is a difference, but it's not massive. So if you want to be accurate, obviously you want to do this. But if you want to understand more of a fueling strategy perspective, then of course you need CO2 to better understand, okay, where are you, how are you using fuels at different times. But here also we have to remember now that when we go into a lab and we test there as well, this is a completely different picture than what it would be if you brought somebody into the lab at the moment they went over the finish line in a race. Because now you will basically see that the velocity that they hold there at the end, or the power they hold at the end there, even though maybe it's much lower, it's still very close to their VO2 max, because basically they are not able. So the VO2 max, everything will come down. Yeah. So there's a missing time component into this very often when we look at research papers, when we talk about this, because we talk about it very often as a spot picture or something that happened in a fresh state, rested state or whatever. Yeah. Or ideal states. Then coming back to the question and to round that up, I think exactly that when you do micro intervals and so on, and we talk about glycolytic and so on, basically, you can use here also your heart rate as a gauge. If you start to see that when you do micro intervals and you're packing in, let's say that you did 310 watts, and you were able to accumulate, that 30 minutes of that during that session there. If you now do micro intervals, so let's say you're able now to bring it to 330 watts, for example, and you do 30 minutes of that, or maybe you even are able to do 330 watts average, and you even accumulated now, for example, 35 minutes of that. What you'll see there, because now it starts to become quite a lot of them there, is that most likely you'll see that you also have a very high heart rate, and maybe equally high heart rate as you did when you did the 5-minute intervals, unless you look at accumulated heart rate there. Because you can here also use heart rate as an indicator of how much time you have accumulated close to VO2 max. Because we know that one of the conditions that has to be met also for you to reach VO2 max is that you also are thinking then you need to pump as a maximum amount of oxygen around in your body in order to do that. And we do know that is a combination of a very, very high heart rate, close to maximum heart rate, and stroke volume as well.
So it's just occurred to me that I've got 8 pages of notes here of things I want to talk about with you, and we are halfway through the first page. So clearly this is part 1 of many podcasts we're going to have to do together. Hopefully the next one will be in person. There are, however, a few things I want to discuss before we part today. We have yet to do kind of a more thorough discussion around lactate. And if I can only discuss one more thing with you for maybe another 15 to 30 minutes before we go, I'd like to do a little bit of a deep dive into lactate. Now, for some background, since I kind of abandoned any athletic goals, and the only thing I train for now is my health, right? It's for my longevity. It's for something I call the centenarian decathlon. So being as fit and strong as I can be in my 80s and 90s without necessarily worrying about what I'm doing today. In terms of trying to maximize my performance today, I'm trying to maximize my performance tomorrow. A very important part of my training, because my training volume is now so much lower than it used to be when I lived on a bike or lived in the water, I'm trying to be maximally efficient, which is always risky because, sometimes you just have to put the miles in. But what I do spend is about 3 hours a week in zone 2, and again, there's so many different ways to describe zones, so I'm not doing this in terms of heart rate. I'm really defining this in terms of mitochondria. So zone 2 is my highest power output where my lactate stays below 2 millimole. So this is very sustainable from an RPE perspective. It's RPE 6 to 7. I can talk, but I'm not comfortable talking, but I can talk. It's definitely below my 1 hour functional threshold power. But it's more challenging than that 200 watts riding around in circles, having fun, trying to just purely focus on position. And I do use my lactate. I do check my lactate constantly to make sure that I'm really hitting that spot. Now, what's the rationale for that? Well, the rationale for that is that 2 millimole is about the tipping point about which you can be in a steady state of producing lactate, clearing lactate. And once lactate starts to get into the 3 and 4 millimole range, you wouldn't have indefinite access to that energy system. You're going to start accumulating so much hydrogen that at some point your physics of performance are going to be compromised. So, you know, I'm guessing, like, let's now talk about this in terms of world-class athletes. So if you had a continuous lactate sensor on an Ironman, in his 7 hours and 30 minutes, give me a sense of what his lactate tracing looks like.
So this is where I differentiate between volumetric measurements and concentration metrics, because lactate is a concentration metric. We don't measure the volume of lactate.
Right, and the plasma volume is decreasing as the athlete is running, so you would expect the lactate concentration to go up slightly, even if the production of lactate is constant.
Yeah. And also further here is that we have made some discoveries over the last years as well, which is when we start to do Ironman training, for example, which also are very different from a lot of the understanding that currently is there. There is some things there that are changing, and we will definitely touch on this in let's say an upcoming podcast. But to give you the trace now, first of all, I think that 2 millimoles, when you have little time to train during a week, I'm very for me, if, for example, you came to me and say, hey, Olav, I need some training advice. For me, longevity, of course, that's the most important for you, or wellness. But we can always say that, well, in the end, it's about whether you have a high VO2 max. Really doesn't matter if you're not capable of moving very efficiently around, just because you're wasting energy. So we can say that for, like, universally, maybe more universally, it's about being able to move more per time. So like we said in the beginning, even moving your head is movement. It's just better we break it down to a global movement of the body, or we break it down to basically, let's say, local movements of parts of our body. But movement is actually the most important thing in the end here for all of us. Then I would say that if you came to me, I would very much look at, okay, most important thing would be to bring joy of exercising and sense of achievement into your training moving forward, because that's what's going to get you out in the day. That's what's going to get you out of the bed. If you look forward to exercising because you find it enjoyable, you'll do more of it. That's the easier way to get you out, and even where you would start to prioritize it over other things you are doing, instead of pushing it always in front of you, and then finally you get out and exercising because you know you should do exercising exactly to meet your expectations. So that would be the most important thing. But if we look away from that, so I would say that it more like the differences between riding also at 1 millimoles versus 2 millimoles, as long as 1 millimole is more sustainable for you over, let's say, over months and years, because it brings more joy to you, it allows you to maybe be more present, or let's say almost use it as a mindfulness session. If that becomes more sustainable, you can think about what you accumulate, because we very often, again, this is a problem very often with research and many things, is that we give a spot picture of something. We look at something in one session or over a couple of sessions, instead of actually looking at over a lifespan or over a long period. And then this is where I think exactly that we very often undervalue the joy of exercising, because we go out with an expectation that, okay, I have to go hard, I have to go all out, and this kind of thing, which is very demanding and taxing on the body, especially if you're not prepared for this.
And by the way, I'll interject there that I can completely relate to that, and I've accepted that as a part of the transition in my life, right? So there were many days, there were many years where I had a belief system that said every single day, without exception, you must burn the pack of matches fully at least once. So it didn't matter what the workout was. there was still an all-out effort of about 3 to 5 minutes somewhere in the day that would probably, when I measured it, I wouldn't always measure it, but it would take lactate into the 16 to 18 millimole range, like incredible pain.
Yeah.
And truthfully, I can't do that anymore because I don't have the mental fortitude for that much suffering anymore. So I love to exercise. There's never a day that I don't want to, but I also don't have to look forward to that degree of suffering anymore. And I think that that's okay, right? That's the difference between being 50 and being 30. And I also don't think I need to suffer that much, certainly on a daily basis, maybe once in a while. But that said, you know, I still really enjoy quantifying my training. And I know that there are many people who don't. And I think for those people, you know, for example, most of my patients are absolutely not measuring their lactate levels during their cardio training. If 2% or 5% are, that would probably be accurate. And for most people, it's what you say. It's, what do I need to do to make you enjoy this? And use your rate of perceived exertion as the guide tool. But look, I still have a little bit of a data person in me, and I like using this metric to maximize the efficiency of, and it's a great way for me to track my progress, right? Am I able to get watts higher and higher and higher while keeping heart rate and lactate more or less the same? And so I'm just guessing that at your level, this must be a relatively important metric, right? I mean, in terms of what is there, well, first of all, maybe just define for folks what a lactate threshold is. We haven't even talked about it. It's not something I particularly care about anymore, but you know, talk about what a lactate threshold is, how it's measured. Do you guys even still do lactate performance curves?
Yeah, but it more as a function of other metrics that I collect.
Okay.
So lactate for me again is a concentration metric, and is a marker of something. And for me, it's a marker more of substrate utilization, or like not an extremely accurate one, but it's a good one. So I would say that lactate for me is a way that allows me to collect more. But this is a redundant metric to other metrics as well, to basically be more precise in the way that I would prescribe or change even the training on a session. So I would say that there are plenty of good surrogates or proxies that you can use instead to do the exact same thing without lactate. But if you're looking more, let's say, for example, you want to know better now, for example, your substrate utilization, or have an idea of that, I would say even argue that you can't necessarily only do one measurement. You have to do a little bit of couple of, let's say, a little bit change in intensities, not much, but a small range there with a couple of measurements to get an idea. Because your, let's say, call it your lactate or your maximum lactate steady state concentration, for example, in a session can also vary based on, for example, dehydration. So, for example, if you go out, you have one lactate concentration today, this might already change in 2 days' time, for example. That's one. But I think it is. But we use it as a way. Okay, how can I make this not too complicated? So,
I mean, I'll tell you how we used to do it, and it was probably much cruder than what you would do, but we would do repeated intervals at ascending pace, or ascending, like meaning descending pace. So ascending effort, descending pace. So if it was in the pool, we would swim 100s or 200s and change the pace. So you'd go out pretty easy for the first one, check the lactate, fully recover, repeat it, fully recover, repeat it, and you're getting faster and faster and faster. So then you make a graph. The x-axis is the speed, and we would note heart rate as well, but we would really focus on speed. And then the y-axis was the lactate concentration, and it becomes a power curve. And again, this is very crude, so I can imagine that now the methods are much better, but you can eyeball them as sort of two separate linear curves, and their intersection becomes the inflection point at which you go from kind of sustainable to unsustainable lactate production, or nonlinear parabolic lactate production. And we would sort of say, look, let's just assume that that intersection occurred at 3.5 millimole concentration of lactate, and we would note what the pace was there. We would say to that athlete, you have to be mindful of exceeding that pace. Now, this speaks to everything you just said. I mean, that pace is going to change depending on your hydration, depending on your energy reserves, depending on your fatigue. So of course it's crude, but directionally that's what we thought about as you have to be very careful every time you exceed that pace in a race, because you're now tapping into a very finite reserve. Is that kind of how you still do it, albeit probably with much more accuracy?
Yeah, no, what I really like with what you say is, one, you talk about inflection point, because this is very misunderstood. Some people still today go by fixed blood lactate accumulation values or concentration values. So they stick, for example, to 4 millimoles or something like this. And okay, if you're gonna publish a paper and you want it to be able to compare with other papers that are out there, well, that's fine. But already here, the problem with that is that 4 millimoles can be accumulated in a whole range of different ways. You can go just above your second inflection point, or just above maximum, like the steady state, and then you creep up towards 4 millimoles, meaning that now you have to have a smaller power output in order to get there. Or you can go with a very high power output, and it would take a short time for you to reach that 4 millimoles there. So how do you go backwards and say that, okay, well, 4 millimoles should correlate to this power? It's highly dependent on the protocol that you're doing there already. But the way that you prescribe, or the way that you describe that you basically said it, is something I would say that this is fine, because the two most important thing, if you want to use it as a way to control your intensity, so you want to, let's say, a different way of controlling your intensity as opposed to, for example, heart rate or other things. And we know, of course, again, heart rate again also is also influenced by hydrations and other stressors and other things as well. So when you are using lactate now, one, I like the way that you describe it. You talk about inflection points perfectly, and make it as simple as you said as well. Depending on how long your protocol is now, you can even say that you can draw 3 lines. You're looking at basically drawing one line that goes through the flat section of your profile, more or less of the lactate. Then you get one that goes more on, let's say, on the linear increase. So you get, yes, for every step you increase in pace, then basically you also see there's an increase in lactate. But at some point you see there's a complete departure between increase in pace and lactate, and it goes complete, or it goes very hard.
Yeah, almost vertical.
Yeah, so this is where you could say that also, then talking back to, for example, metabolism, you could say that the first inflection point is not too far off where you would see your fat max is, and the second one is typically where you would see your maximum, like the steady state is, more or less.
And some people, I think, in the nomenclature call that LT1, LT2.
Yes, we use that very much, because then you are I like to be specific in this sense, because when you talk about LT1 and LT2, then you already have distinguished it away from, for example, MLSS.
A fixed one, yeah.
Because if you talk about MLSS, this actually normally requires you to do a very specific profile. So you would do, for example, longer intervals. So you could, for example, do like 30 minute or 20-minute rolling effort, for example, and you're looking at lactate as a function of, let's say, every 5 minutes to see whether the lactate value is stable or whether it starts to increase. So maximum lactate steady state is basically what it says in the names, is the highest lactate value that you're able to sustain steady state. If you go now a little bit higher in effort or in intensity, or let's say you are accumulating a little bit more fatigue, then basically you already start to see that now lactate is not stable anymore. For the same power output down, I will actually start to see that lactate starts to accumulate going upwards. So it's not steady state anymore.
And what capacity or duration is built into that assumption of LT2? Because again, LT2 cannot be sustained indefinitely. So there's some point at which it ceases to be a true steady state. What does that look like in an athlete?
So this again depends a little bit because at maximum lactate steady state, depending on how powerful the athlete is, and here is also a misconception. A lot of people think that maximum lactate steady state is the equivalent of an RR value of 1. This is not correct.
Not at all. Yep.
So one thing you very often see is that this is something that we discovered. With our athletes through different when we went Ironman and when we went Olympic racing, so short, long, and other athletes as well. And that is that what you see is that the maximum lactate steady state typically occurs at a lower RR value depending on the distance you're doing. So the longer the distance you do, the lower the RR, where you'll actually find that sits at a lower RR value. It is logical. If you look at it purely from a physics perspective, or let's say you're talking about stationary action principle, for example, so or thermodynamics, then basically how do you supply the body with the most sustainable energy, the simplest possible way? Yeah, it comes back to that.
Let's just go back to that for a second. Yeah. Olav. So at an Ironman, at an Olympic distance, are they able to hold LT2 for the whole race? Whereas at the Ironman, are they well below LT2 and closer to LT1?
The problem with very powerful athletes is that already, because now this is the problem where lactate comes in, because lactate only looks at concentration, it doesn't look at volume. So the problem is that the LT1 will already occur at a very high utilization of VO2 max for an Ironman athlete. That means
how high? Just give us a sense.
So, I have to sit down now because now it's more than a year ago, or 1.5 years, or no, a little bit more than a year ago.
But let's just say,
roughly speaking, I would say that it sits in at around
80%. Yeah,
close to 80% of VO2 max.
That's right. So if the VO2 max is 6 liters per minute, at 80% of that, at 4.8 liters per minute, they're at about LT1.
Yeah, and that you already do know that that's not sustainable, because you're already now turning around so much carbs per hour that it doesn't work anymore. So you have to
but hang on. It depends a little bit on the RER, right? Because you're now at maximum fat oxidation. And so what are your athletes? Now, your athletes have one thing working for them and one thing working against them. The thing that they have working for them is they have the healthiest mitochondria on the planet. But the thing they have working against them is they're on a very high carbohydrate diet. And I'm saying for and against them in terms of fuel utilization. So they actually have the capacity for insane fat oxidation, but their system is tuned towards a faster fuel, not a more energy-dense fuel. So let me guess, would they hit 0.8 grams per minute of fat ox? Are they getting that high?
Put it this way, we have had blocks where we just have been looking at how high we can get them in fat ox, and it is extremely high.
You're probably getting close to 1 gram per minute then.
No, even higher.
Okay, well that's on a high carb diet.
Yeah,
it's absurd to me that we are out of time here. And if it weren't for the fact that I had 100 patient calls today that I can't just cancel, we would just continue to do this. So we have officially covered 2/3 of 1 page out of 8 pages. We have not yet talked about what I want to discuss around muscle biopsies. We have not talked about getting into anaerobic threshold, a term that I don't pay any attention to, but I think we should talk about. We haven't talked about the use of temperature probes and understanding the effect of cooling during both competition and training. We haven't talked about heart rate variability, training desire, performance and recovery. We have not talked about some questions I have about the use of PEDs and why they don't seem as prevalent in triathlon as they do in other endurance sports. I could go on and on. That's just finishing what's on the first page. I wanted to really get into MCT density. I wanted to talk about too many things for me to even rattle off now. So you said you're going to be in the US at some point. I hope we could do round 2 of this in person.
Would be fantastic.
All right.
Yeah, this has been really cool for me as well. And what I want to say also one final thing here. Of course, we talk very much about terminology and how we see things and so on. One thing that is important for me to be very clear on is that terminology is one thing, but we have to remember also that people might use these terminologies also differently as well. And as long as a coach and an athlete, for example, have an understanding of something and that works for them, don't get, how to say, discouraged, or don't start quarreling over definitions of this kind of thing, because the most important thing is exactly that you have a language and it does work for you, and that's most important. That some like people like us come and hammer them with a lot of terminologies and a lot of definitions. They obviously have gotten something right, and it's important to have respect for that. And there's also a lot of things that we don't know. There's a reason why we are continuing to do all this research as well, because we are so curious, we want to understand more, and we understand that there's so much still to discover as well about everything we even covered now during this call.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Olav. That was really wonderful, and I very much look forward to round two.
The same. Thank you so much.